Right, this is going to be another episode of the Best Damn League show. Obviously, I am back, not with Dom. He only comes once a split nowadays. Instead, we've got Nymaera here, and he obviously is doing his second episode. He did one way back before, but I hadn't got to repeat with him yet because I did a whole bunch of different co-hosts that I was trying to do week by week by week. So if people remember, I started last split with Zabatine, and what we did is, because obviously there'd been no games played yet, we just did that classic move, which even though everyone... Here's what's weird about this. I feel like I understand media, or maybe I've just been in the game long enough that I don't get bothered by this. Everyone else gets really mad where if you make like a list or a ranking, everyone goes mental on you and goes, that's not right, I wouldn't agree. But that's actually, guys, that's actually literally the feature, not the bug. That's literally the whole point of doing that for real, is so that we can all discuss it. In fact, that's actually why it's good for shows like this. It's actually why I always tell people who are on desks, even though I get it, we all hate the idea you're actually going to be held to a prediction like you're psychic, which we're not. But at the same time, it's obviously stimulates conversation. It's the easiest shorthand way for any fan to get in on the convo and to have like characterization of what you're talking about. So I'm always going to do it. We're always going to do it. Come on then, what are you going to say?
And so the thing is, it's also really good for me as an analyst to do this kind of stuff too, because every time I do a power ranking and I get something wrong, I need to understand why I've done it wrong.
Sure.
And actually, if it is wrong, but I've done it for the right reasoning, and I'm like, this player, I feel like will have this impact on a game or something, and actually that isn't been true. Like, I can look back on that. It's a great way for me to archive things. Like, I remember before Spring, I was talking about, I thought that Karmine Corp would actually be pretty good. Obviously, that wasn't the case. Now I can look back at that and say, well, what did I say there? What was different on it? I can compare and contrast. And what you can do as a viewer as well is look at that and at least follow the thought process. You learn something at the same time. So that's like, everyone wins through this, even if you're annoyed by it.
And I'd even say, I personally find it's actually quite instructive yourself, because until you make yourself put the names down, it's why the classic one is if you ever do like a top 10 players ever, right? What you'll find most people replying do is they don't say take out number 7 and put in this guy. They just say put in this guy. And what you'll find is they just have never done the exercise. So they're like, but this guy's awesome too. I'm like, yeah, but I can only pick 10, mate. So I had to exclude someone. And they're like, yeah, but he's great too. It's like, again, who are you taking out? So yeah, I also agree. It's also good so you can actually see what changed. Because I also think that's a good angle too, which is because we're not predicting, what we're trying to do is from first principles of how the game works, figure out who should succeed the most. So I think it's actually quite interesting to be able to look back. And then lastly, I also do think people are way too kind on themselves in hindsight when they're thinking with their memory. Like the best example is in Counter-Strike. I have actually got the most goated one because the person everyone now agrees is the best Counter-Strike player ever is Simple, right? Now, everyone who follows Counter-Strike, because he was an amazing talent, would tell you, yeah, well, of course, I always thought he could, be the best player and all that. But their problem, my ear, is they never put a record anywhere, ever, any of them. They just thought it in their mind, and then maybe they talked in very loose language about, yeah, he's a really good player. Here's the difference. I actually have the tweets where in like 2016, I'm just like, he's probably going to be the greatest player. I know, if you have that, here's the thing. Even if I'd been wrong, I'd take the L, because when you're right, it just goes. It works, boys. It works.
I think I have two. I had the DFM 21 MSI when they actually did beat
right.
when no one knew who the fucking team was. And I was like, okay, I can actually show up there. There was that one. And I predicted Rogue upsetting Mad in 22 when everyone was really down on like the Malrang roster. And I predicted them making their run there as well, like most of the way through the finals. Like those are the two.
That's pretty good considering they won.
Yeah, considering they were just like the hardest team to predict at the time, I was pretty proud of that. And I've just got so I haven't had any since then. I've had like a good 2 years. We can work on that.
By the way, I also do think the worst example ever, because what's mad is this just shows how you get it from either side, mate, is people don't ever give Wolf, like I'm talking about obviously the American one, not the actual Korean player, don't ever give Wolf credit that he did actually pick LNG to beat T1 guys. Like, you don't know what balls that took for him to actually do that. And then the joke is, he still got wrecked by the T1 fans because he can't win. Like, he's not allowed to win on that one. So it's all good. We understand, and by the way, when LEC with the current environment, you're definitely not allowed to win because, spoiler, we're not French and Spanish, mate. So the problem we have is we have no homeland. We have no group of people. We have no ultras, basically. Because the problem is, by the way, that's actually one thing for real I did want to put out there, which is that is the one flaw with the nationalist approach that people are taking. It's like, logically, the English language broadcast, by that logic, should just be the fuck Spain and France podcast, but like, it's never going to be. So in a way, it's only ever going to really be France and Spain guys. Like, maybe, I guess in the future, you could have like Portugal could do it, or like the joke is like Italy could, but they don't do enough esports. Like, there's not really that many countries can do this approach. Like, what's weird actually, by the way, is obviously, that historically, the biggest joke of all is Germany can't do it, can they? They're like the home region. Like, Germany can't do it, England can't do it.
They have a couple of the Spandau fans which are in the studio, but and so Eintracht Spandau.
Because they even had Schalke all those years ago. They were here way before us.
Yeah.
They could have done this angle years ago. Yeah.
Like some of the Premier League teams are like almost there. They had NNO,
Right.
who's like this no need Auger thing as well, which that team is actually such a missed opportunity from Riot, because that was like all of the big German streamers making a Premier League
Right.
team and then playing in it. So you had like Agarin, and you had like No Way, and you had like all of these big streamers in there. And they went from Div 2 to Div 1, and they were like, well, can we co-stream our own games as we're playing them? And they were like, well, no.
Oh, that
because
could
they
have
didn't
had
want to bend the rules.
impact on the viewership, yeah.
But that would have been
Imagine that.
absolutely insane. And
Yeah.
then you've got some teams like Eintracht Spandau, which have just a huge cultural following because of like the influencers following them too. And you have a couple of them turning up to the LEC studio as well.
Oh, okay.
There's a really funny moment where there was a French and a Spanish team. I can't remember which ones they were, and they were cheering. And then like the German fans just started cheering anyway because they just wanted to be involved with it. And then they were doing their own fan chants. Like, you can tell it's almost there. They just need that one opportunity to like actually have like that common flag to go towards, I feel, because it feels like they're actually closer than they've been for a while.
Well, dude, the thing people don't give any credit for is you could very easily tomorrow make a German team a la a Mad Lions BDS. Think about it. You just need literally like irrelevant upset, and then I don't know, fucking Gilius or something like. That's a pretty good team, like right out the gate. Like that's it's not like I'm picking randoms. Like the joke is I'm not taking RL players. Some of those are just like legit LEC talents. Like,
Well,
yeah, that could even be like a
Kaiser,
top
who's
team.
free now,
There's
so.
Kaiser too. That's a whole Abbott Dargay, mate. You could make a pretty fucking good line. Like the difference is, how wouldn't he be memeing? My lineup could actually like go to fucking Worlds. Like that's not bad. Surters, there's a whole bunch of players out there. So, right, let's get into it then, Nymaera.
Right,
obviously, for this episode, no new games have happened since the playoffs. So we sort of, luckily though, this is where you work as an analyst. You'll get this, but maybe the casual fan doesn't, right? I'm not really going to treat this coming spring split as though it was one day after the finals of LEC, guys. Like, one of the things I actually love about tournaments coming from Counter-Strike, which is an open circuit game a la Season 2 of League of Legends, is I know that between tournaments you get resets. Like, people do go home and then they get to practice scrim, let all the stress go, you make a player change, or you come back and do the boot camp again, that you wind up the form. So, by the way, spoiler, as we go through the teams, we will sort of project who we think will go up, who will go down, where they'll be roughly. And don't worry, I'm not going to do that thing that would be easy, which is just rank people almost what they placed in the LEC. I'm going to do some spicy ones as usual, mate, because I don't think any split in history works based on what the last rankings were. It's always a reset, you know. In fact, if anything, there's the more interesting angle, I would say, is you'll actually realise when we do this discussion who had like good form or took advantage of that meta, and who actually is just really good players and can overcome any meta. So tell you what we'll do, let's just do the G2 one to begin with, right? Because everyone's going to definitely for G2 go, well, they're definitely going to be the first team again, and they're going to win the split, and it's easy for them, right? Here's an obvious angle to go with because it's more interesting is, do you foresee any issues for G2? Are there any like people who might have a downslide because of meta angles or something to do with things you've seen or any of the cracks? Because I will say, even though they won and they convincingly won the LEC, the problem I have with that whole topic is I'll never know what BDS would look like because they took Adam out. So to me, like it's kind of like the league just gave up at the end there. And also, even then, even in that final, I thought the bot lane had some mad dodgy moments. So I'm not going to treat them like they're perfect. Where are you at on G2?
So obviously we kind of have to view G2 as kind of like who could possibly beat them in the LEC as well, because obviously no team is alone in that kind of environment. The context for this is that the last matches we played were on 14.2. I think we're now going to be starting on 14.4. Significant changes have come through. So we've got stuff like Karma came and went. That's just gone now. Well, it might be still around, but it's kind of, yeah. Because that reminds me a little bit of when Vladimir was played in Season 5, where he's buffed to huge high heights. Everyone learned how to play him, and now, even though the Karma's now been nerfed at this point, still kind of fine. Corky's gone, and it feels like also with the changes in AD carries coming through, we're going to have stuff like Senna Smolder trades coming through, and Smolder has kind of ruined LPL at least. It's doing less good in LCK, so I'm very interested to see how that slots into bot lane meta. And how this then goes back towards G2 is that I actually feel like G2 could play multiple different styles, but one of their most successful styles was ruining bot lane laning phase, snowballing through that with stuff like the Draven or the Callista or even the Lucian, which they played quite sparingly, but when they did, I thought they were excellent at it. They showed really good understanding of it. If the meta in EU, and this is of course no guarantee that it does go towards the way that we've seen other regions before, if it stops you playing through bot lane laning phase and crushing the bot side of the map with very aggressive invades and dives and stuff like that, that affects G2 more than any other team in Europe, because pretty much all of the other top teams in Europe couldn't play that style very well, to the point where actually we were avoiding playing the lane dominant supports. We were going towards stuff like the Rel for Alvaro or something like that instead. Labrov was a bit strange because obviously he was picking stuff which was more about grouping up in mid lane and throwing out blitzcrank hooks or like the Rakan engages through mid lane as well. So like some of these teams never really committed towards that identity. We didn't really see them play towards that in the first place. But that's one of the big things which I'm looking at first. It's like, okay, so that's one of the tools which G2 use, which I don't think is going to be as strong. But on the other side of things, we've got stuff like global mid lane is now being very, very powerful. Twisted Fate is a 3-role flex. We'll see if it makes it down to AD carry, but definitely a mid and top lane. It's a lane dominant AD top laner. It's a really annoying global roaming mid champion for some of the great TF players in mid lane too. You know, you've got Caps, Humanoid, Niski, players like that, which I think will really benefit from it. And then stuff like Talia is arguably best mid laner on the patch too. Also see something like Azir is also disabled because currently there's a bug which meant that it wasn't played in LCK today. So we'll see whether that affects the first week and how long that takes to get fixed too. So with globals coming into mid lane, stuff like the Talia and ways for Caps to get really inventive flanks, I went back and did a VOD review of the finals just a day ago, actually, for Mad versus G2. One of the most important things about this team was how Caps could just punish teams that overpush over a line of vision because they weren't great at vision control. And he is fantastic at doing that just through regular teleports. Now, if you give him a global to do that, just give him another route to do that. If you suddenly add in the Twisted Fate as a dominant top laner too, that affects Broken Blade. When you've got stuff like Viego coming through for Yike, who's arguably Europe's best Viego player as well, I think even though the bot lane losing potential win conditions through early laning phase could hurt G2, everything else looks good for them. So arguably, they could even get better. So we'll see whether other teams can contest on that. But kind of with all of the meta changes all together, I think G2 are actually looking pretty solid right now compared to where they were even, which is a good thing.
Yeah, I will say, actually, the one thing about G2 that I'm very interested to see is when this lineup was made, one of the cool aspects of it is, a la last year's JDG, in theory, it's a team that you look at and you go, you could actually play through any lane here. Like, if it ever did swap to being, like, carry tops, I mean, people would argue some of that was last split, although I wouldn't say necessarily it was that great from the other teams, but people would say you could play through Broken Blade, you could play through the solo lanes, but I actually have to say, if I ever look at the ups and downs of G2, they are nearly always at their best. The times they look unbeatable is when the bot lane is the best and they can play through the bot lane. And actually, what's interesting is when I did my interview with Trimby, one of the interesting things he said was that actually Hans Sama is someone, this is a very interesting take, actually. Basically, Hans Sama, the joke is, sounds like a Forgiven type ADC, not a reckless / traditional sneaky style ADC, essentially. Like he said, Hans Sama's whole thing for real, this is why apparently he's so vocal, is like he really literally plans out the whole laning phase, mate. Like he'll tell his jungle like what wave he wants him to dive on and tell his support like we're going to trade on this wave. And his whole thing for real is like win the game by smashing the lane in 15 minutes. And then the idea is that he can group and do whatever you want. You have like ultimate agency, right? Whereas in the traditional style people would think of, especially for European ADCs, is more like you get through laning phase, then it's like give me my items, then we'll group for me later. And you know, once it's reckless style, it's like, you know, eventually if I'm on the right champion I made it to that point, the idea is if we don't have to fight, I just scale and scale and scale and scale, and then eventually we win whenever we want, right? Apparently he's not that type of guy. And I have to say, when you look at their team, not only how much success came through bots, but you think last year where the whole style was like the second they got the advantage, just snowball the whole game. So I actually do get the vibe that like even if they maybe could go these other ways, I get the feeling that's the tendency within their team that seems at the more like the crux of the team. So as long as they can still play through bot, I think they'll be okay. I think they'll be totally fine. Quite frankly, their lineup's still amazing.
They'll still have Senna. It's just really sure. Basically what we've seen a lot of, and again, I'm going to take the LPL as the example because that's the region I'm most tightly tied to right now, and I've watched a hell of a lot of games of Smolder, Braum, or Smolder, Alistair just sit there. You can't break that lane open, try as you might. And eventually it scales up to 225 stacks on the Smolder passive and then 3 items. And then you can't front to back ever, because that champion just wins in the DPS race.
Right.
LCK's done things a little bit differently. I feel like they've managed to shut it down more. I think that they've managed to play engages better to not allow Smolder like peak DPS. But if it comes into Europe, and I think on the whole, yeah, if you're talking about the class of EU AD carries and stuff, most of the bot lanes we have right now would prefer to wait for an item or two and then fight rather than use the first 3 levels of the game. Like, I mean, the very obvious one is something like a Kalista Renata, which tries to kill you right from the start of the game. It doesn't just stop until, like, you've died at level 3 or level 4, and the jungler comes down to help with that. I think G2 can play that style, as I said before. I don't really think other lanes will be doing that, but I think that means that potentially they will benefit from picking something like a Smolder with an Alistair or a Braum, which can just make it very hard to dive. It's not really an interactive laning phase. You're just waiting for them to get into the equation. So I am very interested in seeing how G2 deal with that, because they're also one of the most kind of heads-up teams in regards to like seeing this stuff coming and then planning something for it. They've not always hit the mark with it, but I mean, if it's going to this is inevitably going to happen in Europe, so I want to see them have an answer to that first. They're also a very good center team. I think Hans is typically one of the better centers in the region too, so I don't think that's necessarily a huge problem. But there's some moving parts here. I just want to put a pin in very early.
Yeah, so I would just say there's no reason for me to dispute the idea that G2 will be the best team. Right now, they have all the pieces, and crucially, the players are just so good. Like, this unironically is a team where, like, especially now after seeing the I-Class split, the joke is every player actually is an MVP candidate in this team if the split goes the right way or the meta goes the right way.
Mickey in finals was less good.
Sure. No, I mean more like fundamental quality, though.
Yes,
like,
yeah, no, for sure.
To potential. So when you have that, like, it's hard to bet against a team like that. Right, let's just flip it up and go completely the other way then. What about then the dreaded Karmine Corp? Because obviously Nymaera, the interesting thing about this one is a lot of people are really going to treat it like this is one day after the last match and they're just the team that won the 2 games at the end and they lost the 7, etc. But I think the most interesting angle for me to set this up is obviously they don't have the same coach, which is not minor, and then they didn't make any player changes, but there has been time, and presumably they have scrimmed, etc. since then. And so one of the interesting things is I actually do get the sense, I don't know which way, I think everyone has to pick for themselves, but I do get the sense there will be a change. For me, either gets even worse or it just gets better and stabilizes. Like, I don't think it stays the same personally. What are your thoughts for Karmine Corp?
I actually think that gameplay is so secondary to this team in terms of like the meta stuff. It is completely mental. We saw how they played in the last couple of games, and it felt like their solo laners finally got engaged with the team. It felt like, that stabilized a platform to Bo to play the game, and things kind of clicked into place. But this is all mental now at this point. I think there is some value for change for the sake of change if mentality is actually what's affecting things. But like, this does come down to a lot of individual players kind of not playing scared and not getting involved in the game. I think that is particularly going to be an issue if you have someone like Saken. I remember the game they had against Larson on Rogue when he was playing like Akali into Corki. That's a good matchup. And he ended up something like 6,000, 7,000 gold individually at the end of the game, which is an incredible like individual gold disadvantage in any matchup. But in one which is supposedly an encounter matchup, it's pretty unforgivable. The thing is, if you have one of these games where suddenly that player doesn't just get blown out completely, then these games look very, very different. I'm a little bit worried because it feels like Rumble isn't as playable anymore, and that was a big thing for Cabochard. I think that some of Rumble's matchups are starting to turn a little bit against him. I think that a lot of people have now figured out that Aatrox, if you build him full lethality, can eventually just one-tap just Rumble in lane with as soon as he gets that one item, and that's a big problem for him. And I think that potentially removes some of the pressure which Cabochard showed in some of the good games which he had. In terms of bot lane, well, if you're playing stuff which doesn't really have to interact with lane, like you're not going to get center lanes through for Targamas anyway. He's too good at the champion. I think that's something which I think was never going to be put through in the last split. I'm interested to see how they adapt to something like the Smolder that potentially can help them put things on rails, slow the game down, and then just play for a later game scaling condition. Hopefully someone like Upset can have more consistent mid and late games than he did last split. I don't think he was, the primary offender for Karmine Corp, but it's a question of, if you give him the superpowered carry of the patch, which can kind of ignore bits of laning phase and come online, 3 items, 2/2/5 stacks, that is much easier to play around. In fact, there's been a bit of a trend worldwide, maybe not in LCK, but I've definitely seen it in LPL, where teams which are not good at understanding their compositions are starting to play very simple stuff. And these simple things are scale for Smolder, Viego resets. These are 2 things, because they're really easy to play around. It's so obvious to play around. So that's why we're seeing stuff like the Viego and the Nautilus. 1 kill means that you get resets, you win the fight. Smolder, same kind of thing. You survive the laning phase, you get stacks, you win the fight. I think if Karmine Corp can kind of pick up that kind of style, and that kind of helps them stabilize the mentality, there's a road there. Just depends if they recognize this early, really. So yeah, I want to see them commit towards like the more simple styles of play, because I think LPL teams have actually been really benefiting from that overall.
My take on this team goes like this. I actually think it's one of the reasons why to fire Yamato kind of after 1 split was so dirty, is that to me, I've just seen too many teams in history, guys. Like, here's the thing. You're all thinking that what I'm going to say now is since Yamato kind of was fired, they'll be even worse. Well, that's the joke of what they've just done. It's like it's almost impossible to actually be worse. So whether Yamato kind of was here or not, they probably were going to actually improve a little bit. And in fact, I think actually just just the break of having the split and seeing so many weeks off. Think how many weeks off they've had now, guys. They were done after like 3 weeks, remember? So they've had ages off at this point. And if they hadn't had any roster moves, in theory, you could have been doing anything in between this time. And also, the new coach guy is someone who was already there. So this is another thing that's mad unfair, because now, if he does well, you're all going to go, see, Yamato was the problem, and the Riha guy or whatever is the solution. It's like, no, he was already there, though. So essentially, he already potentially contributed, but also was benefiting from whatever Yamato did before. And then now, even just the fact that they're together longer, they've learned from their lessons. Essentially, I actually think this team will have an uptick, Nymaera, but I'm not going to go crazy. I don't think that essentially the coach is going to like fix everyone, and Yamato was really the problem. So basically, what I think is this. I'll first of all be very, very cynical, but I'm sorry, I've been in too many scenes in esports in Counter-Strike to not think this way. I actually do think, believe it or not, guys, that there is a world where when I consider the 3 worst players on the team performance-wise and relative to expectation were the French-speaking ones, I'm sorry, I actually will go ahead and tell you, I predict that having a French-speaking head coach will help those players. I'm just going to say it, certain people, it's not, because here's the point, I don't think that's on Yamato's end. It's just when I've been around French people, by the way, Koreans are very similar, they just like their people, and they like things their way, and they don't want to have to think about the culture thing. They just want people who get them, essentially. And so I'll tell you, my experience of French people in international teams, I think this is even why I think Vetio had issues when he went to some of the other teams, is sometimes they might complain in a way where it's almost like a bigger cry for help, that they actually want you to sort of go, hey, what's going on here? Is there something we can issue? But they'll just do it as if it was like a minor complaint. Oh, this thing was shit here. And so you might just think that's minor frustration, but that actually might, if you're from a different culture, you might think, oh, it's not a big deal. If he was really upset, he'd say something to it. But they might not. And so essentially, this is where it's not as simple as like everyone speaks English, so we're all from the same culture. We all have different weird tendencies and backgrounds and ways of conflict resolution and all these things. So I actually do think the French coach will probably help a little bit in that regard. And being as 3 of them were playing bad, mate, you only needs to get like 1 or 1.5 of them online, and you're already going to get some results, you know.
And in terms of like the track record of the coach coming in as well, so Karmine Corp was very successful at an ERL level when they got to EMEA Masters. They were actually they won 1 LFL split playoffs, which was back in LFL 21 spring. So obviously a while ago now, actually. And then they just couldn't quite finish it off in a lot of playoffs for a while. And then the only other time they won LFL kind of like in this stretch was actually the split which Rhea came in in 23 summer, and that's when they won LFL playoffs, and then they also won EMEA Masters as well, and that was in Montpellier in front of like the LEC stage as well and stuff like that. So this guy coming in and like there just being the history of success with them and kind of like having that camaraderie through those wins as well, I think that can be a factor because you did have the 3 French speakers, Cabochard, Saken, and Togmas on that roster. There is just something about that coach-player relationship and kind of knowing that feeling of winning and when things are going right as well. That can kind of...
Well, you're going to trust him in a different way if you've won with him. Yeah, for sure. For sure.
So, and particularly with the history of Karmine Corp and like actually losing a lot of LFL splits, even though they would win the Masters. I mean, I think it was spring. Yeah, in spring before he came in, they were 9th in LFL, and then that was with a different roster. I mean, they still had Cabochard, Saken, but like all the 3 other players were different. They changed some players out, and then of course coach comes in as well. They get that real success. Maybe they can start summing some of that again. I'm not going to lie and say I know the players personally. I don't really know what their relationship is with the coach, but like in terms of kind of like, if it is going to be down to mentality, these are just like little extra bits of context which can potentially fix things. Because again, we already saw actually how they kind of shook off some of the rust really in the last week of play. And hopefully they can get themselves a bit better on form. Because I think it's better for the league if they're playing well. I mean, I prefer to see higher level LEC as much as it'd be nice to be proven right about certain players. Like, oh, this guy was bad individually or whatever. I'm like, it'd be better for the league if they do well and hopefully get to push some of our other teams to do better too.
Like, to me, I do think some teams that we'll get to are going to be a bit more exposed and do worse. So the thing is, I don't think it's going to fix everything. Like, sadly, I don't think this team will ever be what I hoped it would be on paper, which is a true contender. But I actually think if they get it together, I think they will actually be like a 5th to 6th team. That's where I think they will be this split. I think they'll win enough games. They'll be in like a series or 2. But the problem is, I do think there were enough issues in actually what I saw in the game, like the way they just had nothing after the mid-game, basically. That makes me still worried. I don't think you fix that overnight just because the coach changes. But like I say, I'm going to give them I'm going to bump them up. I think actually, if I think of some of the other teams we'll get to later, I think there's obvious reasons why some lineups will be at the bottom and will be worse. At least this team, I mean, the joke would be this, Nymaera. Even at its absolute worst, they were still in loads of those early games. And that was the absolute worst, where we're supposed to believe the coach was totally wrong and everything was burning inside. So if that's the case, I think it's actually quite easy for them to just win a few games and be not in the mix, but like be at least in the playoffs.
I could see them winning a handful of best of ones, yeah, for sure. I think when it gets to series play, I think I can't see them getting into top half of LEC, given that I think they're at the bottom half of LEC, and a lot of the teams we'll get to, as you're rightfully kind of saying, there's a lot of them where I think I look at those changes, I'm like, yeah, I don't see the upsides of that, or like it's minor at best. I think Karmine Corp, because there is at least the room for explosive growth. It's just a tiny bit. Like we can give them the credit and say, yeah, I'm not saying higher than 6th, but I will say they can get into playoffs and maybe take a game, maybe take a best of.
And by the way, I'll just reiterate what I've said many times on my shows. I'm not a guy, by the way, like some people on Reddit. I'm not just going off a story of like, I heard that Bo in the FPX though, in the LPL. Not only, guys, did I watch all those games, but I've talked to loads of the pros when he was in Vitality last year and Karmine, and they all tell me, by the way, in scrims, it's all true. He's an absolute demon, and he just like, the joke is they say in scrims, he's like so good for the first 15 minutes. There is no scrim. It's just over. So I also do think, that's why with the other players I talked about, they essentially only have to play like people with hands. That's it. You don't even have to be good. If they just play like a semblance of decent league, this guy will win you a bunch of BO1s himself. He'll have the right carry champion, he'll have the right setup, he'll get going early, and he'll just snowball the game. So that alone's going to get you 3 or 4 wins, guys, I'm telling you.
Yeah. Next year, it's going to be Karmine Corp Milky Way. I'm telling you, same thing.
It feels like it, because the joke is when people see the rise of him, I want to just tell people, no, you see why we were hyped about Boy, you idiot. It's the same thing. A guy just walked in and won every game. The joke is it's even the same team. Right, okay. After this, I think the team we go to now is, let's get the drama out the way. Obviously, Heretics managed to, I would say, double dose on drama, because if you remember, this was like spread apart and people need to know the chronology. So obviously after the split, I would say if you look at their split, it's actually perfectly explained by the like fucking form they had. They started pretty well week 1. Everyone's like, hey, this is pretty hype actually. Maybe G2 2018 topside does work. Then every week was like diminishing returns. And then by the end, you were actually sort of like, is there any point even continue with this thing? I guess the vibe everyone had. And so what happened bizarrely was, though, at the time, I'm pretty sure even people like me who might love all the G2 topside, that's where some of the player issues clearly were. Like, spoiler, even though it sounds like heresy to say it, jungle and mid weren't too fucking hot this split. In fact, you could say mid was pretty bad, and these are the GOAT players, obviously. But the problem is, that's not the roster move. The initial roster move, and this is the key thing to make here, guys, the only roster move was actually going to be Kaiser, who actually really had a glow up and looked way better. Him getting kicked out to bring Trimby in, who, yes, look, we all want back in the league. I get that as a wider thing, but obviously the question here was like 1-for-1 as a support. Kaiser right now was pretty good. So you're already gambling on it. There must be intangibles. You must want other things from your team. But then now, the weird thing is that was going to be the only roster move. And then the story goes that they went away, came back, started to play the scrims that essentially are the warm-up for this split. And then all of a sudden, question mark, question mark, question mark, Perks is benched. And now the Zivru guy, who was the academy player, who apparently was good, gets a chance to come into the league. And basically, the problem here is this. We have to do all these angles. We have to do the Trimby for Kaiser's side. Then we have to talk about the Perks. So let's do the Trimby for Kaiser one. When you heard this move, was it a shock to you? Do you think it was the right or the wrong move?
When I heard it without context, I was really questioning it. The context added from the video which came out yesterday, which kind of explains from at least what they're presenting to us as the story of things in regards to saying, oh, we found that there was a real lack of leadership in mid-game. That concerned me on a number of levels, because I know that Kaiser is a quiet support in regards to planning the game, and as far as I'm aware in terms of Mad Lions, it was largely Kazi and Elioya planning out how they played the game, and Kaiser was kind of following the plans. That's kind of an EU support thing in general. But if you are going to look for leadership in a support role, then it makes more sense to saying, even if you take a dip in individual performance in terms of laning phase and skirmishing execution and stuff like that, yeah, I can understand bringing in Trimby, because actually I feel like he has had more clutch initiations and that kind of more macro leadership style. In some ways, actually, he's had to learn to be quieter in some ways, because he's been on teams in the past where no one was speaking, so we ended up speaking too much and adding chaff into the mix of communication. But I think he's ended up doing quite a good job of developing on that front. But then that adds in another question, which is, okay, when I came into this split, when we came into this year, my first thoughts was, okay, there was a really good vlog or whatever it was from Heretics. I think it's the Passion YouTube series they do, and they kind of have a look behind the series of the team and stuff like that. Well, last year, with the initial roster, they were saying, okay, Jankos wasn't a strategic shot caller before. He would do like the short-term playing, but he wasn't necessarily the guy that would do like the 5 to 10 minute plans or something like in the overall gameplay. And my understanding was that was Perks that did that on the old G2 lineups when he shared that with Jankos. if we suddenly now skip a year later before Perks in the team, Jankos was trying to be molded into a strategic shot caller because that's what they needed in the team, and he has a lot of veterancy and authority, I guess, from his level of play. What the hell has happened with Perks for him to not be the EU strategist anymore? Because that's the viewer that I had of him. And actually, if that's no longer the case, and that's been a huge problem, which we can kind of see from Vitality in the gameplay, does this actually in some ways affect my view of Perks? Yeah, it does actually at this point. Because what the hell is happening in this team? You've got a lot of players which he has a working relationship with before. It seemed like they were willing to run this back on a roster which had mixed expectations, but maybe you can, put it together with that camaraderie and stuff like that. The fact that they are missing mid-lane game shot calling, I kind of get it from Kaiser in one way. I don't get it from Perks. So if you have to then replace, support for Trimby, I can kind of get that. But the fact that you had to replace for shot calling of all things is a big issue. So the fact that it's kind of muddled about, you've got... now, I was always told that his name was Vero, but then when I heard Aranea say his name in the video, it was Zyro. I don't know what I'm going to call this.
I will say the reason why that's confusing, obviously,
the CS player.
Yeah. The problem is, like, not only do you have the French CS player, but I will say what you're saying sounds more plausible on Nymaera, because in Poland they tend to say the W is a V, don't they? So Zvyro would make more sense, I think, than Zviru or whatever.
Yeah,
that sounds more plausible to me.
I cast this guy winning EMEA Masters finals with Heretics. I'm pretty familiar with this guy's journey through ERLs, and I was told Zvero at that point was Zviro.
Is that a good pickup, by the way? Do you think is he worthy of an LEC spot?
So he's been good for a while. I'm really impressed with how he finds that optimal spacing within team fights, particularly on mages. I remember it on Victor. Nowadays he's doing it on a lot of stuff like Orianna too, where he finds. So there was a match he had in LVP recently. I think it was versus Ramboots or something like that. I'm not as familiar with the teams down there. Right now anyway, where he was kind of playing Orianna versus Tristana, where a lot of it is about kind of where you ball position and where you position yourself, so Tristana can't straight jump on you and you can just shockwave them out of it, buy yourself some auto attack uptime and get good damage down. And he was really good at that. Typically this year, Zvera's been just on mage duty. He's been putting out a lot of DPS though. I think his DPM on average is something up into 750 or something like that, which is actually pretty damn high. Now he is on a winning team and he has Xerxes is jungler who's very good at facilitating laners as well. So there are mitigating factors in here, but if you're just trying to have a stable mid laner that brings value from strong laning phase and good team fight positioning, yeah, this is your guy. I think this will be completely fine. I think if you were going to call up players like Ruby beforehand, or hell, even someone like VTO, if you're trying to have someone who's a bit more versatile, I would have banked on the guy you've had in your organization for all this time. He's been pretty clutch. The whole team was pretty clutch actually when they won EMEA Masters. So yeah, if you're just looking to get an LEC stable mid laner, on the level of, SK tried Certus before, we've tried some other stuff like this. This guy is probably one of the better shots in Europe to do so. So I'm happy that he's got a shot. He probably has deserved it for a while, given the level of mid lane in Europe right now, and then also the names which have been called up. The question is whether you're calling him up and then kind of introducing him to these systems which are apparently not working with Heretics, when you kind of, again, looking through the video which they posted recently, are you resetting your progress, integrating 2 new players in? Because you've obviously gone into scrims, things have gone to shit, you replace another player. Have you reset it again? Or is this going to be, again, something which can be positive with the change for the sake of change? Because anyone making changes between winter and spring has to do that kind of as last resort because of the financial pressures of keeping a player like Perks on your bench and also having to mess around with contracts midway through ERL split, because a lot of ERL contracts, they don't have it bolted into them that you can make changes between winter and spring, because ERLs are halfway through spring. They don't have a winter and spring. It is 2 splits rather than the 3 splits, which is why I think any of the changes we actually talk about in this split, for me, they are very bold, because what this assumes is you have seen a far-sighted issue, one which is in the future, and you're trying to get ahead of it because you know that it won't fix itself by the time you could maybe make an easier change between spring and summer. So the fact that this is happening right now, after they made another kind of change to that support role, this is either going to be kind of cauterizing the wound, or this is going to go double badly, because it's quite difficult to actually make these moves happening at this point in the year.
What's wild is this is one of those cases where I'd heard some stuff behind the scenes from people within Heretics, but throughout parts of the split, including up to this drama. And it's one of the rare cases where sometimes what you find is like the stuff behind the scenes doesn't always actually like perfectly fit with what you're seeing in the game or who's doing bad or who's doing well. Sometimes like actually one of the problems if a fan doesn't know if you're a casual is sometimes actually the star who might be carrying the game and the losing effort might be the dickhead who's ruining the whole team. And maybe the idea is he's bringing the vibe down so he looks good because he's getting what he wants, but then everyone else isn't. So it can be quite. This is a rare case, Nymaera, where almost everything I heard seems to make perfect sense. Because what's weird about this team is if I watch them play, the reason why I was so hyped never ever made it onto the server. Because the joke is, if people remember watching this team, I've always told people when I've doubled down on perks all these years, from Cloud9 into Vitality into now, is I've always told them, I'm not telling you he's fucking caps. He is not going to smash lane and be up XC. Like the joke is, if people remember, in Cloud9 it was basically that they didn't have like shot calling and fucking map movements in that region. So if he just did that, he could win the games. Then when he was in Vitality, he was actually a half decent laner. He was actually doing a decent enough job there. There was other bigger problems in the team. The problem now is this. This is the worst perk split ever. I've never seen one that even came close to this. Because the joke is, whereas normally I'm expecting him to like make the smart move or make the game saving move. First of all, as a team, one thing this squad never had, and this is so sad to have those veterans, they never had the G2 quality. They never had that thing of like, right, they're behind in the game, so they're going to pull like a crazy move now. They would actually, for real, just let themselves get like slowly bled out and just lose in the most unsatisfying manner ever. And you'd be watching it thinking like, bruh, that's like Wonder Yankos and perks. Like, what the hell is this? Like, the joke is this should be like Mad Lions rookies or something. You know, people who are just scared to make a move and just let themselves lose the game. And then, so first of all, a lot of that has to go on Perks' shoulder because he used to be the guy who came and did those fucking sick plays. And he doesn't do it now. And the problem is, I was hearing behind the scenes that like this might be the split where he was being a bit of a diva with his teammates, etc. Which, listen, you have to remember, guys, that makes sense in the past when he was amazing. At that point, you actually have the status where you can ask for like more and be more demanding. And then after that, the other years, I always used to hear from his teammates as coaches, he's a brilliant teammate. Like he's the one who drives you forwards. Well, the problem with that is if that ever goes dark, like the person himself has individual form issues, so they're a bit lost in the game, or they ever just get so that like, you know, the status bar's been increasing, but their actual ability level in the game's going down, you're going to get this moment that's going to be really jarring when you're almost telling your teammates like, hey, do it this way, but you couldn't do it yourself. You couldn't execute. That doesn't work. If you're not the big star, superstar player they can rely on, you can't make those sorts of demands. So if that's the case, like before I get into the rest, already that makes so much sense as to why this team was so underwhelming, mate, because they never had even the perks factor that past teams did.
That was actually my first take on the situation. So when I first kind of like saw that article come out about, you know, perks has been removed, and then it was kind of like, and they you know, it was cited that it was about a dispute with the manager and stuff like that. My first thought was, well, if there was a dispute, all that really is, all it really has to be is a just cause to remove a player that's already not being easy to work with and not playing well. If he was playing well, you can gloss over a lot of things. Winning, it smooths over cracks. So my first thought is, he wasn't really playing that well. He actually was the individual cause of a lot of losses on an individual level in the way that he played out various areas of the game. If anything goes wrong at that point, then it just becomes a casus belli. It's a just cause. I mean, you're just going to remove him at that point. I was surprised that he wasn't looked at to be removed earlier if they were going to make changes at all, which then obviously makes you think, well, okay, probably something significant has happened to some degree. In practice environments and atmosphere and stuff like that. Because again, any changes which are being made at this point, I really want to reiterate this, it's very difficult to make these changes happen. Often it has a lot of like financial cost to it too, because now you're going to have perks on bench, you're going to have Zvero playing at LEC rates rather than his ERL rates. And you do get paid, obviously get paid more to play in LEC than you do in ERLs. You've signed Certus to your ERL roster as well, and he's an LEC boundary level to okay level talent. Actually, I don't think he's that bad. He'll be demanding, you know, a decent amount of pay as well, coming in as a free agent last minute. So now you've got extra costs going towards it. You are doing this to get ahead of bigger issues which you've seen already, and you've said, okay, this is not getting better in the short term. This is not going to work well. Even if we leave this and try and fix it over to summer, the trajectory of this is all wrong, so we have to get ahead of it. So yeah, my first thoughts were when I heard this, I'm like, okay, this is an impasse. Let's see if they've made the right choice. There's every chance that this goes badly, but then you have to think actually the alternative is if they'd stayed the same, actually could have gone just as worse, and then you've never even rolled the dice on getting better.
I'd also say as well, like on that Perks' actual level of play, I do think this was far and away his worst split. Like, the joke is, not only did he actually do some game-losing plays, dude, when I actually went back and looked at some of the first weeks, he even had some game-losing players where the rest of the team just won the game. Like, that's the opposite of Perks. Like I'm saying, if I go back to Cloud9, I actually did think that Cloud9 team was a bunch of people who didn't understand deep macro concepts, and he would just sort of do a move, and he was just like the Pied Piper. They were like, I don't know what the fuck he's doing, but just follow him, and maybe he might win you the game. Maybe he might like clutch victory from the jaws of defeat, as it were. The joke is he was doing the opposite here. He was almost the one like throwing the game, and then actually the joke is people who don't have the same status like Flacken and Kaiser were fucking saving it, were dragging it out. And so here's the part I want to get to, which is the spicy part about this is, I actually think you've nailed it there, Nymaera. This is the part no one's figured out, is like you say, when you bring in Trimby, the only reason, because of how they played at the moment, has to be that you want shot calling and intangibles, right? It's the most obvious reason to bring him in right now. But as you say, but why would we need that? We have Perks already. But do we? Because here's what you do. You bring in the Trimby guy. So that means at this point, Perks, if you're not a good mid laner and you're losing games and you're shot calling, we don't need you anymore. So the problem is, the issue is though, Nymaera, if you really have all the status and your Perks, we can't just go, right, Trimby's coming in, Perks, you're benched, because that'll be a scandal. So what if instead we sort of bait you into getting wrecked? Essentially what we do is, this is the story I heard, Nymaera. This is why the spiciest part that every fan's missed is actually the Perks tweet. You know, the Perks tweet was just hashtag keep smiling, which is famously Arena's slogan. People don't know that, Nymaera. That is Arena's slogan. So if this was to do with that other coach, like whatever his name is, like that fucking Spanish one, or like Peter Don, that wouldn't be the tweet. That implies that Aranea did this or was somehow part of it, right? And all you need to know is I heard this, Nymaera. I heard maybe Nymaera, I heard maybe that Aranea did a Reggie in TSM. He came in when you're doing like the practice and the VOD review, and then they maybe had some sort of a dispute, or there was a dispute in the room, like maybe it was the other coach with him, whatever. But the reason why that's relevant is this, because I actually think if you follow the track of what I'm laying down here, I think that's just the setup at the end, isn't it? It's like you've had someone who's maybe been a bit of a diva, maybe they've been taking control too much, maybe they're making the wrong decisions. You've already got their replacement. All we need now, like you're saying, is a just cause to remove them so no one can say we're dicks.
Oh, you'd be surprised how often that happens as well.
And they've nailed the PR on this, because if this is true that he actually had like an outburst, which by the way, the worst thing about this as well is that's genius move if you want to remove the guy, because in the moment he's going to feel justified, like, hey, someone's arguing with me, like, hey, all I did was fight. But it's like that is the straw that broke the camel's back. So sadly, I do think that's why this chronology seems so weird to everyone. Like, but why would he be there in scrims if they remove him? Because it sounds like for real, this was just the setup to do it in a way where they wouldn't get backlash. Because at the end of the day, he is like one of the most decorated players of all time, guys. It's hard to remove that player, because as Nymaera says, what if you remove him and now the results actually continue badly? Then everyone will just say you're an idiot. Whereas actually now we know, well, if you removed him for behavioural reasons, maybe it was justified. I think it's actually, even though I'm a massive Perks fan, I will say from all the things I've seen and heard, I don't have a problem with this move. It seems actually fairly legitimate. Yeah.
And I heard some stuff behind the scenes, but this is one of those cases where, like, most of the time you can kind of get to the bottom of it if you know some people.
Sure.
I've actually heard like 2 or 3 different things which have happened. One of the people that was caught up in that was saying like, yo, I wasn't even in the country while this happened. It can't have been me.
Okay.
So there's been some of this stuff where, initially I thought I'd gotten to the bottom of it. And then I heard some other stuff from other people and I was thinking, well, okay, well now something's gotten weird.
Well, I'll give you one last thing that everyone does forget, because this is where just journalistic understanding of laying the chronology out helps you so much, mate. People are forgetting one last little drama bomb, which is, you guys will not remember this, but before officially they kicked out Kaiser and brought Trimby, there was that weird leak where actually a random fan had messaged Peter Don and was like, what the hell? Like, Trimby's joining instead of Kaiser. And by the way, in these messages, which they're now like, was from a DM, Peter Don basically tells him like, no, that move's not happening, which implies Peter Don didn't know that roster move was happening, by the way. So that alone should tell you right now that there's some weird stuff going on in Heretics, boys. Yeah. And I've even heard along these lines, like that message, I've heard that it wasn't like everyone was in consensus, like, yeah, the Kaiser guy needs to go. Like, I've heard that might be a move that might have just come from who knows where, mate. So that's why this whole thing just looks like some powder keg of egos and Game of Thrones and all sorts of shit behind the scenes.
It's also precisely like when I hear stuff, I tend to wait to see if anyone can back that up, which a lot of people don't tend to do, because I know that this is not what I'm practiced to do. This is not exactly what I'm here to do. Yeah, if I hear stuff I can back it up, maybe I'll drip it in on a podcast or whatever. But like, I'm not going to say stuff which has like huge implications about big players. That's putting my head on the table too. Like, yeah, I can hear 3 or 4 different things, and I mean, at the end of the day, how it's affected Heretics is I think actually the org, as you've said, have actually managed the PR of this somehow really quite well. And the fact that also with the whole the keep smiling thing, Aranea looked freaking dead on
It was
that
interesting,
video.
wasn't it? Yeah.
And I've ran into him a couple of times.
Because if people don't know, he's an
nice guy.
incredibly naturally positive, but he's a guy who's I've never seen him look that dejected, mate. That looked really strange.
Yeah, and I think it was also quite telling. I mean, I know Peter Dunn said he was on a social media break as well.
It's interesting he wasn't in that video, though, isn't it, mate? Come on, I would have thought he'd be the first guy in there. You know what that makes me think? I'll give you a speculation, pure speculation. I'm not going off inside info. That makes me think, mate, he didn't necessarily approve of all these moves, whichever ones you want to pick. And that made me feel like if I don't make the choice, I'm not putting my face on it. You know what I mean?
And if he was already on social media break, I don't know whether that's for other reasons than anything. Actually, I can't deal with this.
Well, the joke is he actually did say he was going on a social media break. I'm pretty sure right after that leak thing I'm talking about. Like, I'm pretty sure that made him like, I'm not DMing anymore. Like,
and particularly given the results of the team, you think, okay, like you can understand that before, but then obviously we don't know the chronology of it. What causes it, and you can't really speculate on it. But either way, it feels like you don't have anyone who's like a gameplay specialist to talk about gameplay reasons as for why a player is being removed, presumably for gameplay reasons and stuff like that. The body language is all over the place from that video, and like my heart kind of does go out for the management staff because you don't really want this stuff dropped in your lap again between winter and spring. This is a very difficult time to make changes in the LEC, but yeah, at the end of it, I don't even know if Heretics get better from this. I mean, I think Sfero's a good player. I think he'll give probably more base value than Perks was because he was really quite a detriment to the team at some points. But you're changing so many different things. I think LPL kind of found out the secret to building a super team is you keep a good functional jungle support duo together. If you're trying to like build a top tier team, changing that midway through a season, like that sucks. You got to learn how to do all this stuff again. So there's a chance this is going to get worse before it gets better. I don't even know. And maybe this is now a situation where they think, well, we can build towards summer with this, but it's going to be a bit of a duff split here. But it's better than building between spring and summer and then resetting the timer on that too. So I don't even think they get that much better this split. I think they're still pretty bottom, maybe kind of like cusp of halfway point. I don't think they get above 6th again. I think they're probably bottom half of the table just while they figure stuff out, actually thinking about it now.
My issue is just I feel like there's a lot of pressure now on this Viru guy. Like, he's essentially going to have to be a star for me because I also do think, I'll give it up to people who said this last split, which is, I think it might even be Rich who had this take, is his problem is he also thinks this team, I can't remember who it was who had this take. Someone just thinks this team never had enough firepower, basically. They think like everyone's viewing them historically. So if it was like Wonder from, season fucking
that was my call
season
as well.
7 or whatever, and if it was Perks from season 8, but it isn't. So the other issue is the Zero guy's going to have a lot of fucking pressure on himself because I think Flackett is good, but he's not fucking forgiven, guys. He's not going to like hard 1v9 the game. So I think the team gets better, but I also think that's because the rest of the league gets worse. So I'd say I'd maybe have them like 4th to 5th range. I think it could be decent, but because the thing is, I'm a big Trimby believer.
Based on the other teams, I think they're actually going to like definitely get better with some of these changes, or like some of the meta changes. So like I'm not quite as confident because I just feel like they've set their timer a little bit too far back. We're making changes halfway through the split.
Yeah, but here's my angle: is if this allows Jankos to just be Jankos, mate, you can win a lot more games than you did before. Because that was the other thing that was so sad. Is like it's almost like Perks and Jankos, two players with some of the craziest intangible ways to win. We're almost like neutralizing each other, mate. Like I can't believe how ass their synergy was, bro. Like that's supposed to be like the best synergy of all time in our league. It was ass. It was fucking terrible.
Yeah.
Anyway,
like, particularly given how 1v9 he was, that's been probably the saddest fall off of this team time, actually.
Right. What about this then? A team that I actually found somewhat tortured me last split was SK Gaming Nymaera. Because not only did they start strong, it's not even that they just started strong and then dropped off. This was just one of those roller coaster teams. It was just up, down, up, down, up, down. And it could even be game to game like that, mate. They could show you a game where you're like, fuck, I'm in actually. Maybe this is like the 3rd best team in Europe. Like, fuck it. You know what? Maybe they can even go to the finals. And then you'd see like another game where like someone like a Fnatic would just blow them away and you'd be like, what the fuck? And then also this other team had another thing that really did kill me. I know Niski as an individual player is often maligned like this, accurately so. Monty always brings it up. Like he is the player that will do like an amazing player and then it's like he just instantly, like gambler fallacy, does like a massive int right after. The problem is this team does that, bro. Like the team, they have moments where they're about to get it together. I'm like, dude, it's actually a really good team. And by the way, I actually love the GMing. If you ever know how much budget they're working with, they're always actually doing a GM masterclass of getting a little bit more value than you think out of different spots. Like the joke on this one is obviously the irrelevant guy, even just keeping him is genius. Like He actually low-key's like sleeping the best top lane, and somehow he's on fucking SK Gaming where there's no way he's getting paid mega bucks. So I actually look at so many parts of the teams. I like so much of it. But I will just say it this way, I mean, I do not trust this team at all. Like, this team's got like KT roster levels of will just absolutely betray you at the worst moment. So where you at on this squad? Because obviously they didn't make any changes. Like, they keep the same team. What do you think?
I think the meta potentially helps them because stuff like Talir is the best mid on the patch right now in a lot of ways. So that obviously helps Niski. Twisted Fate is really helpful for Niski as well. Yeah. And also, if you can play that top lane, irrelevant, sure. Give him a lane dominant champion. This guy's fantastic. Now, if that combos it up into Isma being able to path around aggressive pushing lanes, I think he's a good jungler. I don't think he's great at trying to like consolidate the map when he's lost things. I think that when he's put behind and when his lanes are put behind, this guy looks like a completely different player. Of course, all junglers do, but I think at Isma, the real strength of him in the early, in week one was, hey, I've got really good pushing lanes. I'm going to make some creative pathing happen so I can dive top lane or something like that, which is not always the easiest thing to do in the current meta because like typically everything is kind of around going into enemy jungle and going to bot side as well. He's actually been getting some good top lane dives off. So I think in terms of meta around what I'm seeing in other regions and what they're playing in solo lanes, I think that helps. A couple of the tanks are kind of gone now. Hopefully, Kasante's just been put to the sword now. He's had some really huge nerfs, so maybe that means that you can get stuff like the lethality Aatrox coming in from Irrelevant a little more. I think that Jax is still fine. I think all of this stuff's pretty good. And then if you have, that kind of like teamed up with, Niski on globals, all of that seems like good on paper. But that's the ideal, and the real crux of this issue with this team for me is that I don't think they know what their own strengths are. It's the whole know thyself kind of philosophy. I think this team, every other draft, has like a really question mark for either Isma or for Niski. I really didn't like it when they were putting Niski on stuff like the Hui. I don't really want him on something that's a mobile artillery mage. I want him something that can make plays earlier and move about the map. That's not really what I want from that player. So while I think the potential upsides in terms of meta are pretty huge for this team, it really comes down to, do they know what they're good at? Which is kind of a shame, because it feels like looking into that team, I can tell what they're good at, but they're not really giving them the best tools to play around it. So for me, it's on a collective level, do they figure out how they want to play? Because the ideal situation looks all right.
I also do think the player that I'm going to put all the X factor on is Isma, because I do think when he was able to play well, he did look really good, actually. Like, the joke is, I even made the point that, like, in some ways I feel bad for him, because whereas the other players who got promoted to Mad Lions get the props of, like, we came for the... He did as well. It's just, everyone forgets because he's not Spanish, and he wasn't on the team. But the joke is, he also actually looked way better than he expected in LEC. But then you saw the games where he struggled and he has hard times, like you saw in some of the playoff series. If he was in the game, they were a way, way worse team. And then also, the last one, I want to ask you one more thing about this team. And it just goes like this, Nymaera. I have a really hard time with Exakick. Like, Exakick, to me, the problem I have basically is he either seems to mega hard carry or just not be that good. Like, he doesn't, like, I don't see him as the player, like, game to game, I can always rely on. But he does have, like, mega carry games that look sick. And by the way, his team clearly knows it. Like, you can see some of the comps, they know that, like, if this guy doesn't, like, do all the damage in this fight, we're not going to win. So, like, they clearly get it. What's your thoughts on this player? Because my trouble has always been, like, normally when I have players like this, I'd think things like, right, what if I switch up their lane partner? But in his case, he's obviously, like, demanding he plays
well,
on
the
this
whole
one
point
lane.
They brought him up was because of DOS
So
as
it
well.
sounds like that's not an option. So what do you think of Exakick?
I think he's really good when he's on champions with obvious power spikes, which allow the team to then facilitate him because it's very easy to call for resources and know how to play the game. I think when it's the kind of thing where you've got to stall it out a little bit more, and maybe you're on something like an Aphelios or a Senna that is kind of a little bit more like it's a little bit hard to know when the go button is, as opposed to, I'm a Lucian, I have 2 items, I have my ultimate ready, let's go burn someone down. And I think actually they were like the one team in Europe that actually even got a win on Lucian at first as well. They were the first team to get one. Then of course they lost to Karmine Corp right after, which dampened things a little bit. He's a Kalista player, he's a Draven player, which again, it's very obvious what they want. They want to, control early laning phase, and then look for like specific power plays where either you can get like a big dive on Kalista and take over whole swathes of the map and objectives with your Rend as well, or the Draven who's just looking for the bare kills to then get the shutdowns as well. My problem then, quite obviously, with what we said about Isma and the solo laners too, is that if you then put him onto something with a less obvious power spike, the team then doesn't really have that same confidence and decisiveness to actually play towards these players' identities. I think that this is probably the number one team in Europe, I think, that has the biggest issue with actually figuring out how they want to play the game. Because, yeah, I think that this is another guy who has quite obvious strengths. And, like, stuff like the Varus, had 2 games on it, lost both on it. The Aphelios and Senna played 1 game each, lost all of them. But actually, his Callista's been really good. Really obvious how you want to play around a Callista. He's got a couple of games on the Draven, 2-1. Actually, pretty obvious how you want to play around that. So, yeah, I think he has obvious upsides. Maybe then your issue is that you just, you target one of these players and draft as an enemy team and you say, well, if we don't give them the obvious win conditions or we give them a bad matchup for the champions which they want to be playing, well, maybe that's an issue because, it's much easier to prep for that. But it does feel like, SK, most of the time with the players, it comes down to, well, are you playing towards this player's strengths? And a lot of the time when they're losing, the answer is, well, no.
Right, let's have some fun now, because here's the thing. Let's talk about Mad Lions. They were in the finals. By the way, there's actually even a world with how the fucking G2 bot lane get played. That even could have been 5 games. There's a world where it really could have happened. The problem I have, obviously, is I don't think they would actually have beaten BDS if Adam had played and there hadn't been whatever fucking drama went on there. So here's the thing. I'm fine giving them I'll give them 3rd. That's where I thought they would have finished if you look at how the split played out. If I actually watch how they played, there's plenty of things to talk about. I actually think they did actually sort of, even though it sounds like a cliched sports ball narrative, bringing together players who had played together previously did appear to give them pre-existing synergy. Their coach clearly knew their ins and outs of the weaknesses and the strengths. So, I do also think this is one of the better drafting teams. And the biggest meme of all is I would have told you that the whole angle of yeah, but they're Spanish, so it doesn't matter that the players are worse, and they're all going to rally around El Yoya and play around that sounds like such a stupid little kid's power of friendship meme, but it sort of does work. I can't lie. If the idea of this team was hey, El Yoya, this is going to be a vanity project based around you and making you look dope and everyone doing what you want, they sort of made it work. It actually works as a concept album, as it were. It actually did work. El Yoya's the lead singer, but it works. So, but here's the problem, Nymaera, is as there's been a change between the splits, and I do think some of what allowed them to win was also other teams being bad. I'm going to sort of low-key hate. I actually don't think they're going to be a top team personally, but I am interested to watch them. So where are you at on them? Because obviously this is going to be a spicy one. Where are you at on Mad Lions? Because spoiler, unless you essentially predict them to come second, anything below that, you are actually hating everyone Spanish. You're possibly racist, and you will get loads of tweets. So that's okay. We got all know that's the brave new world we live in. It's all good. It's all good. We know that already. So give your thoughts.
The way I'm going to phrase this is, I think they can place really highly. I think they don't have the best chance. It depends how you value your teams. I don't think they have the best chance of beating G2. I think that's actually Fnatic in some ways, because of very specific reasons why they don't succeed against them. Now, I did a VOD review of the finals, and it became quite apparent to me when I was watching through it again, for slow and kind of slowing things down and saying, okay, well, what skill sets are they really showing? Very, very good at decisive early game motions, and very, very good at firing off their own combos. Very good at that. I do think, though, that there are some higher level concepts and some macro and vision, which they're just clearly not at it, top level at. One thing which I really talk about G2 with is, and this is important because it's why Mad can't contend with them on this level, is that after a fight has happened, and it's a close fight or it's won or whatever, regardless of the result in some ways, typically what happens after that fight is you drop wards and then you either reset or you move somewhere else on the map. Now, if you picture G2 and Mad having a really close fight and there are some wards drop down and Mad push up, G2 immediately punish them because they know how to play the second fight in that chain, where you use the wards which you just put down to force another fight just afterwards. There's a great example of this where I can't remember which game it was in the finals. It was the one where Broken Blade was on Cannon, and there's this point where Mad kind of get themselves a good fight in mid lane. They pick off Mickey because they were doing that the whole damn series, actually. Mickey was way out of position. And they get just way over their heads, and they say, okay, we've got this fight. Let's go push down mid lane. They get teleported on behind, and they die. Now, the teams which this remind me of is RNG 2022. I think they were the most obvious team that did this with the Xiaohu thing. That was their entire style. I think T1 have done that a lot more recently as well. That's a lot of the ways that they come behind in games as well. And I think that G2 is trying to emulate that kind of style as well, where even if they lose that first fight, they are ready for the second one right after, and they'll save some globals for that, and they'll just completely cut you off. And I feel like Mad are one of the worst prepared teams to do that, because they just kind of brawl whenever their cooldowns are up, and they kind of feel they can take that. But they're not prepared for the second fight after those cooldowns are down, even though they're still pushing forward. So I need to see a real level up from them, particularly in terms of clearing vision and making sure you're actually safe to do things. The problem is the immediate knee-jerk reaction is, oh, we're getting punished for being too aggressive after the fight, so let's stop doing that. No, because you still need to push the advantage, but you need to do it in the right way. So there's a lot of learning in terms of the higher level concepts from Mad, which I think will gatekeep them from beating G2 in a best of series. I think they can do it in a best of one. They won the game one of the series in the finals, partly because they were playing very similar composition to G2, where actually both teams looking to just snap engage out of Fog of War. You know, you had a Yasuo and a Zac on one side, and it's like, well, okay, you lose vision control for 1 second, pops out of Fog of War, you die because the combo's there. And G2 were trying to do a similar thing with like the Twisted Fate, again, snap engaging out of Fog of War. But the thing is, Mad had a lower cooldown, so actually when they were looking for the second fight, they were doing it while G2 didn't have those cooldowns. So again, it's kind of like this kind of back and forth in terms of this style. But in terms of the actual high-level vision control style again, I don't think Mad will contest with G2. I think they can do that against the other teams in the LEC, though. And I think they can do that even against teams like BDS, who I think are very good around controlling mid lane. Really depends on top lane matchup to see if Mirwin's actually going to be a factor in these games, or whether someone like Adam or whoever's playing in top lane for them kind of shuts him down as well. I think Mad are still going to be at the top echelons of LEC, and I think that the confidence that they've shown in being able to successfully play their combos, that's going to keep floating for them as well. I don't think that's going to change with the patch changes. I think that they've got a lot of stuff they can work with that. In a lot of ways, I think stuff like Super on the Smolder in the center, I think, well, his center wasn't fantastic. I wouldn't say that was his best pick, but stuff like a Smolder, I think that fits into his wheelhouse, where it scales up into infinity. The whole team can play around him being a DPS source, but then also Smolder has this long-range ultimate that can work in the dive combos that they like to play as well. So a couple of the champions which are coming into meta, I think it works for them. I think that this team, they're very confident at picking out different stuff, and they'll innovate to come up with the power picks for the other teams. I think they are still, well, we'll see if, you know, BDS or Fnatic collapse again, but I think they're still top 3 for me. I just don't think they're the team to beat G2. I think there are other teams where maybe I rank them overall as a 4th or 5th because maybe they've placed worse against a team like Mad. I think, you know, maybe they'll do better against G2 because I prefer the way they play around higher concepts of the game.
Yeah, the thing is, I'm going to have this team as, I actually think I'm going to have them 5th to 6th, even though people are going to go mad off that. I don't care. Not a problem for me. Because I do think if I look at teams like G2, BDS, I have as better anyway. Fnatic probably, like, I'm guessing I'm maybe putting like an SK can maybe sneak over. I have them at a similar level to Heretics, if you follow where I was saying before, or maybe just above a Karmine Corp, that sort of a team, because I think some of these teams just have good players as well. The problem with this team is, I do like the teamwork. I actually think it's well drafted. I even think, by the way, that fucking top and support are like the revelations of the fucking LEC so far. We already knew Elyoya was good. It's like, it wasn't even his best split, but it didn't need to be. The problem I have is, though, I essentially think that, like, it's kind of like the first part of your analysis. The problem is essentially a lot of their strengths and advantages were things that like they got early on, but I don't see why it would increase essentially. Like I think they can maintain those things, but as the other teams either improve roster or get better at the game, I think their strength drops away a little bit. So I don't think they'll win as many games personally. Like in the playoffs, that was the thing that really shocked me was their playoff run in the lower bracket. They looked nothing like the team that was in the upper bracket. Like they looked way better. Like the team that got spanked there was like, that should have been a team that came like 7th or 8th or 5th to 6th. Like their run through the low bracket was exceptional, but I didn't see that the rest of this play. The Skovy guy got it together in some of the play. He hadn't been doing that before that. So the problem I have is if people don't know, I'm not a believer in mid and ADC. They actually did overperform for what I expected, but I don't think these are fundamentally top players personally.
I thought Fruscovy should have had his shit kicked in. This guy, like, he should, and he even said in an interview, wow, I thought things would be bad, and I was like, I thought I'd be bad, and I was like mediocre to good, so I'm like, I'm actually quite disappointed in the level of the mid lane. That's what he was saying in one of these interviews, because he thought he would go worse for him. So I think for him, that's a big confidence boost. Looking at the meta for him, if you can just keep spamming Talir and teams keep giving it to him, he'll have value. I think I'm a bit more of a believer in Super. You know, I watch this guy in ERLs, and I think that my problem with Super and Alvaro, which will be an issue, is that if they're put behind this, they fall apart. This is not a good bot lane when they fall behind in a game. Now, the thing is, they're actually very good when they go get ahead in a game, and you can start forming a game plan around them, which is why I'm quite interested to see if they do pick up stuff like the Super, which the Smolder, which again can just like keep scaling into infinity, and it can just inevitably be a win condition for Super. I really didn't like it when he was on that one Kai'Sa game, and it just feels like they keep picking fights when they're behind. So they are not complete players, but when you play towards them and you have very consistent early games, because actually Elyoya and Alvaro have very good early games,
they do,
you get to you get to cover those weaknesses to a point where I am actually more happy with them, because look, obviously, if this team does somehow get internationally, this is going to be an absolute disaster for them, because they're going to get put behind a lot by other teams that know how to play early game. But as it stands in the LEC, I'm not confident enough in other teams' early game plans to like actually expose the weaknesses as much against this team.
That was the other thing that shocked me as well, is when I was going back, so I was actually looking like to see, because the one player for me that could have done this is, there's a world where if you wanted to pick an MVP for the whole league for Mad Lions, it would be Alvaro in my opinion.
Yeah.
But when I went back and looked, here's why I actually on side select ended up picking Labrov as my best support. I didn't even pick Alvaro at all. It's because here's the difference. When I went back and looked, the whole team's about getting that fucking bot lane ahead. Yeah. So like, I know what you mean, Nymaera. The problem is I never saw him in, like, the joke is he's supposed to be a rookie, so I'm supposed to think, fuck, what's he doing in these games where they're losing? He almost never is, guys. Like, essentially, he was always in a position with agency, whereas the difference was Labrov really was just sometimes in lanes that were not being played towards. He was just hooking the shit out of everyone in like mad mechanics. So I just went with my eyes on that one. But I certainly think the Alvaro guy is mega. But that's the other thing. Part of me also thinks, like, look, we all got shocked by Mad Lions. We maybe even all got tricked in the playoffs. We all thought, oh, they're going to be the easy opponent to beat. Now that we've all seen them play at their absolute best, surely the coaches are going to fucking play differently against this team. You're not just going to let them power up that bot lane every fucking game. Like, this even seems like a game where if you're a really strong roster, you just cynically, like, fucking match them or something, or just, like, never ever let them get it ahead, or just play super safe in bot lane or something. Like, I feel like there's so many angles to this. So I also hope that people will sort of level up how they play against the team, because the other thing is, this is clearly another team where you're not just battling the players, you're battling the coach too.
Yeah,
like, he clearly does have massive influence. He's getting to do his game plan in the game. So, yeah.
And I think in regards to that, I guess one of the bonuses to Mad with this is the fact that Alvaro and the coach, I think it's Melzer, have done a lot of work together in ERLs too. And as far as I'm aware from people who know how this duo, kind of as a coach support duo is, like, Alvaro is a really good voice for the coach in the game. Like, he's really aligned with the same kind of style of gameplay and stuff like that. So, yeah, it's going to be quite hard to completely lock them out of the game. I mean, if you draft, if they're drafting 3v3 bot and then you also draft 3v3 bot with the junglers coming down and you lose that, then obviously you've just doubled down on a losing situation. I'd at least like to see people contest it though. I mean, we saw G2 try and hyperdive bot with stuff like the Twisted Fate, and then they had some other lanes there too. And it did feel like the bot lane of Mad was still getting pretty consistently ahead though. So even G2 couldn't pull it off consistently. So again, like, I understand the theory, but if G2 are not consistently pulling that off in a finals, we expect them to be peaking. I think there's still windows where, with the level that LEC is at right now, I think Mad can do quite well, at least within the region.
Right, let's switch it up then. How about let's talk a bit about, we'll do like one of the bad teams, then we'll bounce back, right? I have to say, I am going to be incredibly cynical right now, because straight up, I actually do think if you look at all the teams, like, look, if you notice already, I've been actually anticipating a world where Heretics changes and Karmine Corp changes can help and it can improve, right? Two of the teams I actually have no hope for at all, Nymaera. And it's so sad, because actually these players aren't all shit. Like, actually the joke is, if this was like a solo queue game and no one could come, some of these teams would win. The two teams, I don't care in what order, I think will be bottom of the league. I think you can pick the order, but it's GiantX and Rogue. I think these will be the two worst teams in this split. Even though GiantX made the playoffs, and even though Rogue won a game of I don't give a fuck. Like I say, if this was solo queue, I mean, these wouldn't even be bad lineups. There's some decent players here. Yeah. But holy fuck, do these teams not work together, though? If you want to talk about the concept of what a team is, more than just the five. Like, the joke is that some of these lineups are less than some of the five players. Like, it's so wild as well, because I don't even dislike some of the players, but I just think there's nothing for me to sort of, what am I supposed to hook into? What am I supposed to get into with these squads? You know, they just look like underwhelming teams, mate. Wait, you pick one of them and let's go.
Let's talk about Rogue, because they changed that top lane. Segenda's gone, and now we've got Finn stepping in after a spot. He was on the analyst desk for LEC, and he was on LEC LCK as well. So he was doing broadcast stuff for a split, but he was still playing solo queue and now slotted in as well. I don't think the gameplay is going to change significantly enough. I don't think that should be the if you're making a change for gameplay reasons, that shouldn't be the change that you're making. Now again, any team making changes between winter and spring, probably not the best case scenario for them. Now I have, I've spent time around Segenda and Finn. I see them around Berlin, I see them in the studio and elsewhere as well. And I will say that Finn, I think, is a more mature player than Segenda. I think Segenda is, I think he's a lot more hot-headed and energetic than someone like Finn. I think Finn is a better facilitator of communication than Segenda. But then also, Segenda, I don't think he was like awful on that team. He was okay. I think that there are some you have to criticize his gameplay because he was given resources and he didn't do what he needed to do with them. But he wasn't like straight up losing them the games. Last time we saw Finn in EU on Astralis, like, he had some good Gangplank games. We remember his Gangplank and his Kled, but like, he's not necessarily the 1v9 super carry of top lane as well. Actually, when he's been on weak side, he's often not, he's soaked up XP, but he's not really done, he was never really the weak side king in the way that others were in the region. The only angle I can see is that it's a bit of a change for the sake of change. Does this affect the atmosphere of the team in the same way that we've kind of ruminated for other teams as well? When you look at the team on paper as well, you have Zolius as the support who... I was talking to folks from the team about it. Apparently, he hadn't left France since he was 8 before he came to the LEC, and he went on his first plane to get to the LEC just this split as well. So this guy is still adapting to things. I don't think he had a bad first split, but I don't think this is necessarily the guy that's going to be the hot-headed leader of a team and like facilitating communication. I think he's been fine, but like this is the kind of level you expect from an okay rookie. And I hope that he builds, but he's not necessarily someone that's going to be facilitating conversation. Comp, from what I know of him and how I've kind of seen him around as well. But again, he's not necessarily the person who's leading conversations. Larson is also quite quiet as well. You have Marcoon, who is actually someone who does lead conversations. He's a very kind of strong-headed bloke who has very clear ideas about the game, for better and for worse. I don't think that always works out for him. I think if you've got someone like Finn, the only angle I can see is that it facilitates communication with him and the team better and helps be a bit more of someone to bounce ideas off from someone like Marcoon, who obviously after a pretty dodgy last split from him on an individual level, hopefully that can get him into a better spot as well. It's pretty flimsy, folks. This is why I'm going a little bit wide in terms of the personality stuff, because the gameplay, this ain't going to change in terms of the gameplay, but that's the only angle I really see from Rogue.
Yeah, what sucks about this move, and this is actually, I was counting this within my analysis that I don't see much improving, is when people were doing these moves at the end of last split, like once we saw the teams that were bad, everyone was making those suggestions, weren't they? Like, right, if you need a mid laner, get Abadagi. If you need a support, get Trimby. And if you need a top laner, get Finn. Spoiler, I will say, some of those players have the same agent, and some of those agents know what they're doing and know how to message the right people. But let's put that behind us. Certain people out there who are Pokemons. We don't need to talk about that now. This is a different show. But what I will say is this. I never understood when people were telling me that for Karmine Corp, because Cabozo, as they call him, wasn't playing well, they wanted Finn to come in. And I want to tell them, boys, sit down a second and let's just think about the players you're referring to. So you want Finn, who, as Nymaera said, is a famous Kled one trick, who was never a weak side fucking like peel tank top laner. He was always, the joke is now his idea of having expanded champion pool is play Jax and Olaf. You know what I mean? Like, he's not a fucking weak side player. You're going to bring him into a team where the one good thing about the team was Bo dives on the backline and you have upset. Like, you want to fucking, the joke is, if anything, they should have been traded for Odoamne or something, mate. Like, they needed a weak side top laner.
Oh,
not
again?
Finn.
Not
again? Finn. That'd be exactly. Great. But the joke is, it's necessary at this point in time. So when they do it on this team, I don't even get it. Because think about this for a second. This is so fucking bad in the bigger picture of the Rogue org, because you did trade from Odoamne to Shigenda. Now, the only reason you could logically ever say you did that, unless you're claiming he was like a toxic figure in the dressing room or was an arsehole, assuming it's about gameplay, that has to be that you didn't want the weak side player. You didn't want the tank player. You got Shigenda, and if anyone's watched the RLs, this is who he is, because you wanted a carry top laner. You wanted someone that could actually be a stud. So instead, you've now traded from like the best weak side maybe ever to like a good up and coming, like promising top laner, but who's never yet made it at the LEC level and definitely hasn't been like a star who's carried games. He just carries lanes basically. And then now you've traded to a less promising guy who essentially was that sort of player years ago, didn't make it, and his only upside, like you say, is a bit of experience. Like, he's been in the league a long time, he's played with different teams. I don't know why this would make this team ever like, why would with all the other problems they have in this team, why would this make them be good? The one upside is this. That is probably the worst split I've seen Larson play. I believe he can play better. But even then, he's a floor raiser. He's not going to 1v9 the game. So best case scenario, you're just in the playoffs at that point in time. But I think in this scenario, even if you get in the playoffs for Rogue, you're going to have to do a GiantX. You're going to get in the playoffs and go straight out and it won't matter. And I actually think it's sad because there are a couple of, like, let's be real, Comp's a skilled player still. He could be in a good team. The joke is I actually do for real think that with both, less so with GiantX, but with Rogue, I think you could take almost every player and put them in a different team and they could be better. But this team, it's not going to happen, mate.
Yeah, I don't. the ceiling of this team is quite low, especially compared to all the others. Yeah, they have great players, but it feels like you're asking for a lot for them to be a top, to be a contender within this league. And some of these players could have been contenders before. It's part of the logic, I think, in terms of picking up Zolis as a support as well, was that they didn't have to focus on bot lane the way they did when they had Comp and Trimby, so they could focus elsewhere on the map. I think they did try and put resource into Skander a little bit towards topside. I don't think he used them particularly well. So maybe if they think that Finn can somehow do that better. I think EU has historically been really bad at playing through top lane, though, and I think that Markun used to do that when he was an XL. Like, in fact, when he first came into the league, he was actually very predictable. Like, he would level 4 gank top lane every single game. He's a far kind of sharp. Yeah, he doesn't do that nowadays. He's more versatile on that level. But yeah, the more I think about this, I'm just like, this can't necessarily be for gameplay reasons. It's not enough of a difference to make this drastic a change at this point in the season. So
this just looks like a change for change's sake, mate. That's my vibe.
And that's kind of what I think for GiantX as well, because they changed coaching staff around. I think that both these teams are in a similar level, and you're like, well, this is probably the changes that they had the room to maneuver to make right now at this point in the split, and they're just hoping that it will just click some kind of domino pattern into place. I'm not expecting drastic changes. They probably will very much be bottom 3 at best, really.
Yes. I also think for GiantX, it's even more doomed. I mean, on that team, I'll even add this angle in, which is I even think a fucked up angle on that team is, even though, like, in theory, you have Oduamne to be your leader, he's sort of like a negative reinforcement leader, guys. He's like the old school dad who tells you, like, fucking get your shit together or you're disappointing me. The problem with that is you can have those guys as leaders. It did work in Rogue, in my opinion, but you've got to offset them with other people. If you look at that squad, it's a really messy team in this sense. It's got 2 fucking Koreans. By the way, they couldn't be more drastically different. One's lived in bloody America for a bunch of years. The other one's just a Korean and living in Europe. Then you've got like Downer Oduamne in the sense of like he's never going to be like fucking sunshine in the room. Patrick always just seems like a fairly quiet character who tries to sort of carry but is never quite as good as people make out. And the Jackies guy actually had a couple of pop-offs that looked all right, but he just looks like another ERL player just thrown into the mix of a hard scenario who probably will flame out. So if I look at the team, it's not really, you notice I haven't really described sort of a very coherent team with a lot of strengths where you can imagine these are like disparate pieces. That's why I say in both this team and Rogue, I'm not actually even flaming players at this point. I don't even think that these are like players who cannot play at the LEC level. It's just I don't think they're very good compositions of teams, basically.
They're another team which doesn't have leadership. I remember when I was first kind of coming to grasp with how BDS were playing this split through winter as well, I thought there was a really good comparison between BDS and GiantX in the areas of the game which BDS was succeeding in, and then of course GiantX were like failing into, because I think that BDS, fantastic team at engaging through mid lane and finding picks through, Labrov and Shao, kind of combing up with the rest of the team. If you look back at GiantX's games, pretty much every game you can guarantee that they lose like a random kill in mid lane from like either a flubbed engage or they don't expect it from the other side. And it just feels like when those come around, I rewind it, I come back and it was like, well, why is this guy here with no support or completely out of position? It feels like they get really lost at a certain point in the game, and it's almost inevitable that that happens, which again, it screams the fact that comms are bad. It screams the fact that people aren't on the same page with what they want to be achieving in terms of, I'm going to ward, let me do something. If you compare this to, I mean, the easiest way to do this is you go to look at one of the best teams in the world, and then you go obviously put the LEC footage right next to it, and you're like, well, obviously there's a huge world of difference. If you look at the way how, JDG use like bot lane and then jungle to like, they sit them in mid lane and they very, very cohesively go into the individual jungle and put 2 wards down, which allow them to then make the play around mid lane. Like, the way that GiantX are doing it is, Ignar's in a random position, or like Peach is in a random position, and someone's just randomly caught out, because it feels like no one is making the call to do this cohesively and do it on a certain wave where the lanes can move with them as well. And that's a problem, because then this comes down to another problem, which we've continually gone back to, is what the hell is happening with EU comms? Because it feels like that is just really quite low level right now, and that affects your entire macro game. When you're changing a coach, I mean, Hidon's a guy which I've heard, positive things about in terms of facilitator, in terms of actual team environment, stuff like that. I see some of the GiantX players around sometimes, and I know, so Don Jake, who owns Ruddy Esports in the NLC, Hedon used to work as coach for that team as well.
Right.
So, I've heard some people have, largely pretty positive opinions of him as a guy. I don't know where he was at in terms of, like, facilitating drafts. I think that some of the GiantX drafts were absolutely dreadful. I think the first draft they had against Mad Lions was maybe the worst draft which I've seen this year, period. It was so bad when they gave over the Karma to Frescovia, when it was like superpowered Karma on that patch, and there was a whole load of other stuff where it just made no sense. If there is significant coach input from that, I mean, you don't know whether that's even Tidon, you know if that's Cast, who's now head coach now as well. But yeah, it feels like, sometimes coaching staff can make a big change. XL have done that before. They did that this time last year. But if you're making this change, I can't remember who said this, but someone said, I'll have to go find a tweet for it, where someone said, if you're making the same coaching changes each year, you're probably changing the wrong people, which makes a lot of sense on this front. For me, this is just got to be the quick rolling the dice dopamine hit. Maybe this will change the environment, because as far as I'm aware, Hedon wasn't a bad coach, and I've not heard people speak positive, like negatively before. This one's a bit of a head scratcher. I don't really see a big change coming through from this. So yeah, inevitably this team probably isn't going to develop that well, and they're still going to suffer the same issues, and likely going to be, I might even say, worst team in the league if Karmine Corp and not. It's between them and Rogue, and I think that. Yeah, I think GiantX might end up getting 10th, which is a really sad situation, given some of the players on this roster, actually.
Well, the good news is, now their former coach can go back to Don Jake and say, hi, Don, can I have a job? So there you go. And he'll say no, because I don't run a shit LEC team. No, but actually, I agree with that latter point, by the way. Here's something people aren't going to think about. Guys, this is XL. They did this last year.
Oh, yeah.
Last year, they had a team. I mean, admittedly, that was supposed to be a super team, but they were in the same position of like, they're going to fire the coaches. It's like, at what point, here's the obvious thing to ask. It's the same problem I've had whenever big executives on a lower level fire people, replace them over and over again. It's like, mate, eventually you're the problem. You're the only fucking connecting factor. So my obvious question here would be, who's hiring these coaches? Like, if the person who hired, like, think about this, guys. Assuming we're going to do the logic, which they would claim, it's not necessarily true, of like the players picked the coaches picked the players and then the players didn't work well, so it must be the coach's fault. Well, then logically, who is picking the coaches that don't work? He isn't doing a very good. Exactly. Whoever that is obviously failing at his job. So my question just is this: when does he get fired? When does he get replaced by his fucking understudy or the person who's going to replace him in the? You know what I mean? I've noticed that never seems to happen on the exec level, boys.
Yeah. And like XL, like this is a team which has had lawsuits against it from like the previous owners and stuff like that too. I've heard horror stories of how the NLC team went as well with JDXL. Like, this org has had some rough moments like that, and I don't know if anything has changed up internally from that. So I don't have the information. I'm going to imagine that it's probably fairly similar, but yeah, this is the kind of situation where you just see, well, okay, are these actually the changes which are needed? And then, yeah, I guess like a lot of people haven't had the same outcry for the coaching changes as like obviously the Karmine Corp coaching changes, which I think that's probably worth talking about, because there is something to be said about, well, you don't know the role a coach really has within a team, because coach is a very nebulous term within Europe. In somewhere like Korea or China, it's much more rigid in terms of the structure which a team puts in, because the team actually has a lot more of a microscope over how the coaching staff is fully structured. In Europe, that's less. We have a couple of coaches, like Peter Dunn and the likes of Mac and Pad. They bring their own styles with them, and you kind of trust in their styles. I think XL now changing it twice in a row means that likely you're probably making changes to the structure as well. And yeah, I understand people not getting as up in arms in it, but I really do think that this change is not necessarily going to get to the heart of the issue either. So we'll see what happens here, but I don't have any hope in this being a big change.
Because if you think about it, the part that makes the least sense is, if you are congratulating the guy for saving your team last year, then how does he get fired for being the one that's done? You know what I mean? Which is it? Does he get the credit or doesn't he? Because this looks like you're not giving him any credit for last year, and he's fired for what he did this year, which is what happened. So, yeah, that's just one of those ones.
The reward for hard work is apparently no work now.
Right, let's do it then. Let's talk about BDS. I've saved them till now because I have to say this is actually one of the teams where I don't have that much changing, believe it or not, Nymaera. I said it before. I do think if whatever happened with Adam didn't happen, it sounds like a similar scenario. Essentially, he'd had minor behavioural infractions the whole split, and then what happened is he's blown up at the wrong moment at his coach. By the way, probably even thinking in that moment, well, you can't bench me before a massive match. And Striker's actually done the fucking big balls move of being like, maybe I can. You are benched. And by the way, I'll always mention this because people don't. Remember, it's not just that he benched him, guys. He almost fucked around and still won the series. Like, that's fucking insane right there. Like, that's a level of gangster I don't think people even are prepared for. But I do think if Adam had played and there hadn't been that issue, they would have beaten Mad Lions. And actually, look, I think G2 would have won, but I'd been very interested to see it. I would have liked to have seen a run back and see what they could do, because the thing about this squad that I like so much is I actually don't think it has that many, like, exceptional players. Like, I do think that fucking Labrov was really good. I told you he's my best support. I actually do think Adam legitimately can be called the best top player. I think he's a really good player now. Beyond that, I think the rest of the players are just decent. Like the Ice guy, I can't judge too much. He didn't have to do that much. I think Nook and Shio, the problem I have is this. Most of the time for me, they're sort of mid. Then they have like the good games, they're above average. They're never super duper. They're never like insane. Like I've never thought like Shio's the best jungler in the whole league, or oh my god, Nook, is he a contender for like? But I've never thought that. But when they play well within the key thing for me is I think this is a very well coached team, mate. I think this is a team where what I saw the difference from the Crowley one to the Ice one, it has to be the coaching staff. Like especially when you then find out that these players, remember, Labrov's the guy who famously in other teams had massive issues connecting with his teammates. Nook and Shio are just both ERL players from France, and fucking Adam was literally the problem child of top lane, who even his strengths used to like backfire and ruin the game for him. So I think this is a masterclass of coaching this team. The way they put these pieces together, they clearly understand. Like we have the term in Counter-Strike Nymaera protocols of like when you go into the site, like who looks where, who throws what flash, who checks the back. This is one of those teams where I feel like their protocols are fucking fire, mate. Because the last thing I'll add in is if you saw that weird dispute between me, fucking Nook, and Dominate, where Nook tried to do that thing that people often do when they're insecure, which is you give them a compliment, but then they take the part of the compliment that isn't totally positive. Like, well, you're really good at this, this, and this. In these areas, maybe you're not quite so good. And they go, how dare you? I'm amazing at everything. It's like, no, the joke there is it feels like even Nuke doesn't understand his own team because, bro, the reason why I'm giving the coaching staff such mad props is because the way that they're able to get like slightly behind or even team fights and just win them over and over again, that shouldn't work. Like, and in fact, I'll just say that won't work if you go to MSI. You'll get brutalized by these LPL teams if you try that shit. But the fact that they do it in the LEC tells me like that these people are on the same page. Like, when they get in those team fights, they know exactly what they're fucking doing. Everyone knows their job. It's actually beautiful. Yeah. Even though I often complain in the modern day that you don't get the sort of old school season 5 to season 7 team fights that were like synchronized swimming. They were like a ballet of everyone knew what they were doing, and you could sort of see each person on both teams going in and out. You very rarely get that nowadays. BDS is actually one of the few teams that seems like they have a sense of what they're doing in these team fights. So I have to say, for me, I'm going to put them number 2, mate. I'm going to put them right up there again. Ooh. I think they're going to be really good.
I think I have some worries about how they play out side lanes and some of their mid to late game macro from that sense. And I think we saw, I mean, it was pretty, the sad thing is we saw it too early in the split versus G2 to see if that was just, first week stuff, because it was their very first game in the split. But it did feel like as soon as G2 dragged them to side lanes, they lacked some of that killer potential. I think this team is fantastic when it comes down to a straight 5v5. In the mid lane particularly, because I feel like they're really good at kind of getting that shallow vision around mid lane, which allows you to look for that snap engagement when someone's out of vision. I think that's why the Blitzcrank really works well for them, because the way they'll try to coin it is in terms of, if you know the enemy doesn't have the response time to deal with a hook in mid lane, then what do? So for instance, I think this is a great example of this is also how you deal with stuff like Lucian. One of the reasons why European teams don't play Lucian very well, and this comes into the overall point in terms of how you play around mid lane, is that you need a 1 ward or 2 into the enemy jungle to see that there's not going to be like a Shinzao flashing over the wall or a Maokai flashing over the wall to kill you when you dash forward to do your big combo, which is where you see all the highlight plays from Lucian, where like they get 2 items in the mid lane and they blow you up. You see like Ruler or Gumayushi 100-0 and win a game to just for jumping on you through mid lane. Most teams in Europe are not great at putting vision a little bit into the jungle to show that your bot lane is safe to do something. Or in this case, Labrov's safe to do something on like a Blitzcrank because he jumps forward and looks for a hook or something similar like that. He has a lot of champions which look for those kind of plays. Same with Sheo with stuff like the Vi, which is very good at just hopping over a wall or out of a bush and then getting engaged into mid lane. I juxtapose this to a team like GiantX, which are obviously very unskilled at that particular phase of play. I think that BDS, I think their success is probably going to be quite proportional to how easily they can bend other teams to that style of play. I think that they're definitely a top team in Europe. It's just now I have to kind of do that kind of the shadow boxing of what other teams do I think can stop them being bent to that style of play. I think G2, I think that they are not going to let BDS be able to do that. And we saw in the series against them in the playoffs as well. After that point, it felt like really things fell apart because BDS just were not even winning at the strength of their game. As soon as they played through mid lane, G2 just slapped them. It was not close. And that was one thing which I was really holding in the positive for BDS. I thought that, if it comes down to mid lane versus side lanes and it comes about the mid lane, maybe they can beat G2. That wasn't the case. I think that when it comes to a team like Mad Lions, even though Mad Lions, I'm not really a fan of how they play kind of, the follow-up vision to a lot of the fights, which tends to be what loses them games versus G2. I think they can force fights away from mid lane with very snap engages, and also just fighting early enough into the game that BDS don't get to kind of organize things, that they can shut down someone like Labrov, who was actually, I think he probably was up there, maybe irrelevant as well for MVP for me from this play. I think, he's very much on the shortlist. This guy was absolutely pivotal to how they played the game. I'm going to put them somewhere in third, fourth, because I do think that as it stands, I'm not as convinced in their early game to allow them against maybe some of the teams which are coming online. I think Mad are actually in that equation, for me at least. They're going to shut down some key players for them and stop them just kind of like reaching that very cozy potential in the mid lane where they can just kind of go towards big engages. I think if they does, but my logic now is that if they do get to that point, I think they can beat pretty much every team in the LEC besides G2.
By the way, I even think a player I do want to give his flowers to is Labrov, because the difference is when he first came in the league, he was someone I remember thinking, like, is this another one of those fucking key race stories where everyone tells you for years, like, you've got to see this guy, man, he's good. And then they bring them in. Remember, they're always bragging about the mechanics of these players. The gods in solo queue. Then you bring them in the game and you're like, they're not doing anything. Like, what? It's like that meme, like, poking them with a stick, like, fucking do something. Where's rank one EU West player? Like, and for years, this guy didn't do it. Like, the joke is, I have to say, Labrov better count his lucky stars that he got to this BDS team, because all those years in the LEC, he easily could have just been cast aside back to ERLs and never ever get a chance again. But now he's actually blossomed on this team. Because I'm with you, Nymaera. Not only is he like individually strong, but guys, one of the amazing things about this team, which allows them to get through not having like the most godlike laning phases, mate, they have really good vision control in this team, actually. Like, they seem to be on the same page. And he's doing a lot of that. So what I love about it is, like you're saying, essentially he's making sure you have like pockets where the enemy just has like fog of war and they can't just attack willy-nilly into you, which will let you get through the laning phase. But then even better, after removing the vision, he then plays the literal hook champion that comes out of the fucking brush and hooks your guy in, and you can see you're going to get kills from that, fights from that. Like, it's going to make it way harder to engage on you. I actually think low-key, like, as much as I've flamed him in the past, I've got to give him props. He's really good now, mate. He's fucking mastered it.
Which is a big difference, because, when he was on Vitality, that team, like, they would actually have some vision, but they wouldn't even know how to use it. And, like, the step up between that environment and whatever environment's happening here, too, is, like, it's a huge difference for him. And, I'm happy for him. I think he's actually playing really well. And he's playing a style which no one else is really doing in Europe. In a role which I thought was worst or second worst role within Europe in the last couple of years. I think top lane and support have been.
Oh, it's leveled up a fuck ton now, though, haven't they? Those two roles have leveled up a fuck ton.
Particularly because of Labrov, really, actually, and part of it because of Adam on the other side too. I think he's the way that they end up. If we're going to talk about how Mad cover some of their weaknesses of their bot lane by just funneling resources down there and putting them ahead, the way that BDS can cover their side lane weaknesses is by having Adam be such a strong individual player on his individually obnoxious champions that you can't play around side lanes when he gets such a big lead, even if I don't think the way that they execute in side lanes is as good as you potentially can do for side lanes, but that's typically a problem of Europe anyway. And that, that allows them to kind of like, again, just funnel everything towards mid lane at that point, allow Labrov to play this. And I'm going to give like a slight shout out to Shao as well. I don't think that he is the most efficient player. I don't think he's necessarily going to be the 100% carry and stuff like that. He was very much kind of like the second out of like the trio. If you had like 1-1-3 Shao and you had Yike as the first place, really, in terms of like the LFL junglers that all kind of came up in the same kind of era. And Shao never really had that matchup versus Yike on the other side. But he is the kind of player that will always be there at the right kind of time. Like, he knows what the plan is. And I think that really comes back to the whole thing about the coaching staff. I mean, you look at Striker, who coaches this team, he coached like the reckless Karmine Corp team through to an EMEA Masters victory as well. And that team was shit when they started that tournament. If you watch the way that they had to win through play-ins in EMEA Masters. And, this is a lot of the players that we still know. We still had Cabashad and the roster stuff too. Great laning phase, terrible early game, but they'd managed to be really good team fighters once they got items through as well. And then actually, as they go through the tournament, they start to understand the patch more and they start to adapt more. And for me, the way that team got onto the same page to be actually eventually really good early game teams because they were really good in laning phase, and then they started leveraging off of that and then going towards good team fights as well. Striker has managed to build teams like that before, where they can get into really good team fighting phases. So I can see some hallmarks between the BDS team, which is currently really good at kind of like making sure they can set things up for their strength in this mid lane kind of team fight again. No, I think there's a lot of things working on the same kind of level here. And considering that I thought this team would be fifth, sixth, or something within Europe at the start of the year. I'm pleasantly surprised by them. I do think they have flaws to their gameplay, but there aren't many teams in Europe. It's basically just G2 where I look at them and go, yeah, whatever, they'll find a way through it. Pretty much every other team has some significant flaws, but BDS are, on the whole, making the games about their strengths, and that's kind of what you need to do to win League of Legends. So I'm not gonna knock them for that.
What I'll do is I'll just give people a little bit of food for thought to sort of chew on a bit. And what you'll all come to the conclusion of is you all agree with me and have the same characterization I do of Nuke. You just don't say it publicly and to him, hence why there's no problem. Here's why I know you all don't think he's an elite mid laner with insane mid lane talents. Because his team now, guys, if they're good this split, will have done something like 3 or 4 European splits where they've been an elite team and a contender. And not a single one of you has ever said this guy's an MVP candidate. He plays mid lane in Europe, for fuck's sake. Spoiler, you're supposed to be the instant MVP candidate if your team is an elite team, split after split after split, and you play fucking mid lane in Europe. So that's how I know quietly you all agree with me. You just don't want the fucking people flaming you, which is all good, don't worry. Some would say, I mean, the joke here is this will work in all languages, but in some ways, I'm okay because I'm flame retardant. That's actually a totally legitimate phrase. Look it up, even though it sounds like I got away with something there, but I didn't. Don't worry. It's basically, don't worry about flaming me. I'll be okay. I'll take the brunt of it. It's all good. It's all good. Right.
And this is where I say nothing.
No, you don't need to. You don't need to. Right, okay. What about Fnatic then? So we've left them. Based on what we've said so far, I actually get the sense this is the team that you're going to boost a bit. You're actually going to have them as the contender to G2, right?
I think that they are not the second best team in Europe overall, but they're the team that could beat G2 the best.
Right.
Which is a really unique scenario where I think if you put them in a finals, I think that they have the vision control from based on what I've seen from the games that they play from them. So like I pretty much did VOD reviews back to back of Fnatic G2 both in regular season and then in the playoffs, and then I also viewed like all of the Mad games as well, which they played in the finals as well. And like just the difference in terms of how they are prepared for the second fight against G2, which is really important, is much, much better. Now, are they going to be able to consistently beat G2? No. I think that they're still the team which has the ability to punish G2 in one of their primary ways of playing, though. And if you knock them off that rhythm for one series, I mean, maybe you can get a lucky break against them. I just don't think they are consistent enough across all roles, and particularly when you're relying on like superhuman performances, particularly from Humanoid and Razork, to carry this team like a lot of the time as well. I don't think you're going to beat out the consistency of a team like BDS and the way that they understand the way to play their game. And also I think that you're going to fall prey sometimes to teams like Madkoi as well, particularly when you've got players like Beerwin who are actually upsetting Oscar in a fair bit. And you've got things like this bot lane starting to really get under the skin of what is meant to be kind of like a less interactive bot lane for Fnatic. This isn't like the upset Hellesang bot lane that was kind of like the whole focal point of this team. This is a bot lane which, you know, is good. I do think they are a good bot lane, but they're not necessarily wanting to be the focal point of the team. So yeah, I think specifically in the G2 matchup, you can look, there's a really good example of this once or twice in there was the game where like G2 was playing, you know, the Vladimir and the Akali. So I think it was the regular season game they played against them, where, you know, Fnatic actually ended up kind of like having some moments where they could punish those side lanes too. Even though I think actually if Humanoid plays a little better, actually, ironically, around the fact which I said they played well around in terms of like that second play where they walk over the wards that were just dropped in the fight which happened beforehand. They could have run away with it. They could have run away with the series with the best of one victory there, and it does kind of feel like, you know, they have at least that going for them. I'm just a little bit worried that it boils down a little bit against the rest of the teams in the league. Well, actually, how well is Razzle going to be able to contain other junglers? Is Humanoid going to be able to have, you know, the Hui games, which she's been doing really well on the entire split so far as well? I think that's an important champion. Maybe something like the Twisted Fate coming back into meta can be something that he can play as well. I know that not, you know, Showmaker and Faker, who are typically very good Twisted Fate players, they're not playing it right now. So maybe there are some reasons why Humanoid wouldn't play it again as one of the more historically good Twisted Fate players. But yeah, I think that Fnatic, for me, they are kind of top 3 team. I don't know whether they make finals though, weirdly, because I think that some of the other teams can kind of maybe punish their inconsistencies.
Yeah, I have this team as either third or fourth, basically, edging towards. I penciled them as at third. The reasons why is basically, sort of like you're saying there, basically I do think the player strength of the team is good, but they don't actually have the coherence. Like, this is the saddest thing I think about the league right now, is they have a bunch of teams with good players, and then you have teams that have like really coherent styles, and they often aren't the same fucking teams right now. That's the stupidest thing. Whereas like, when I look at this squad, it's actually like anti-synergies that kill me. Like, for example, one of the reasons I'm also not as high on them anymore is like, I don't know what happened to Oscarinin, but ever since he had that injury, he's never been the same player since. Like he just hasn't. Like he was looking very promising when he first came in the team, and he was getting better split on split. And then he was like, I think he had some bad games this last split. He had some times where, especially like those playoff series, like I was shocked by that, man. Like I thought there was no way Mad Lions was beating them in that low bracket. It's a best of 5 for fuck's sake. And I don't understand it was the BO3, but to lose the best of 5, that was really shocking to me. But it just showed the flaws in this team. So Oscarinin wasn't what I hoped he would be. The bot lane's just whatever. Like the obvious criticism to make there is just like, even though it's going to sound like a veteran level one, I'm not doing it just to hate on Koreans. I would just say this: why import a Korean like that? Like, why import Jun and Peach? Do you know what I mean? If you're going to import Koreans, do it like when you import Bo from China. You import them with the idea that the upside's so crazy. If we gamble works, we just got like a Core JJ or a Bo or some insane level talent. And if it doesn't, then you just let him go and you bring in someone else. Like, to me, the Jun guy, like, if you take the nameplate off, you'd never know this was some Korean player there. I don't know what the fucking point of this one is. So the bot lane's just a bit whatever for me. It's a bit meh.
Yeah, I think like they're good. They're good, but they're not special, and they're not really running the game as well. And this kind of, I said this earlier in terms of, what could potentially affect G2 at the start of this episode as well, where I was saying, with the change in the bot lane meta, potentially some of the lane dominant AD carries are giving way to stuff like the Smolder and the Senna. That potentially helps them because they weren't a team to, I don't really think run over a game from demolishing bot lane laning phase. It's not really been a thing which Europe has done outside of, mainly G2 doing that. You've seen a couple of other teams do it occasionally, but it's not really been the story of the league. They're just kind of there to be, kind of backup playmakers for particularly mid-jungle who are kind of running the show. And that's why often it does kind of become about, is it going to be a humanoid or a Razok pop-off game? I think that humanoid, we've been blessed with the fact that he hasn't had, regular season humanoid performances because he has to be a really big playmaker for them. And yeah, I think that Oscarinin, I expected more consistency out of him. The fact that he kind of like collapsed after some really awkward moments was not fantastic. I thought his week 1 actually was pretty good. I thought that there was a game versus SK they had where they lost that one, but actually the reason why they were close was Oscarinin got ganked so hard early by Isma and he got put down behind very early, and it was Jax versus Renekton, I think it was. And then you think, okay, well, the Jax is ahead, you're Renekton, not great. That's pretty bad. And he was behind like something like 2,000 gold individually. And you'll just see him kind of like manage to get onto both inner turrets, even though he's really far behind an individual matchup. And he actually ends up pushing Niski out of a lane, like jumping over a wall and catching him, blowing a flash and pushing him out of lane. So he actually ends up getting 2 individual turrets while Irrelevant is trying to support mid lane as Jun's on Blitzcrank. So there's some mid lane threat there. You can see kind of clawing his way back into the game. And I thought, hey, European top laners are not great at understanding how to execute on side lanes. I mean, you've got players like, I think BB does, and I think Irrelevant can do as well. But then besides that, it's kind of like Adam, who doesn't actually know how to play side lanes, but he plays champions who are so obnoxious in a 1v1 that he calls like 2-3 people over to him whenever he's doing something on a side lane, which is not quite the same level of actually higher level understanding of how to do that on any champion as opposed to just obnoxious champions. But yeah, I thought that Oscarinin in a week 1 had a little bit more of that knowledge. It felt like it, but then I just never saw that really again, and it felt like those individual advantages which then he could take into team fights and have big advantage. I thought his team fight presence was great in game 1 in week 1 as well on the Cassandra and the Renekton. That didn't really reprise itself too. So if he is suddenly becoming a lot more inflexible, and then you have to go up against players like, what happens if Cabashard's in form? We saw him even like beat Irrelevant in the game. We've obviously got Irrelevant in that conversation, Adam. I think that the level of EU top lane has now gotten to the point where if Oscarinin is playing at that level, he won't be given the same degree of error that he has done before. And again, it just kind of feels like, so you've got, I'm not going to say non-participant bot, but it's a following bot. They're not the instigators. So you're really relying on this mid-jungle. And if one of them has a bad day, yeah, I think they will lose to some of these other teams. However, what you are hoping, though, is the fact that they have the higher level understanding when they're on form to actually have, the vision control to beat out some of the better teams. And like I said, they can have a good matchup versus G2. I'm just really worried that it comes down to mid-jungle. I don't want it to reduce it to that, but it feels like that's the case.
Even though it's not as bad as it was when they had the other issues of Razork Humanoid in the past lineups, the difference is this isn't like fucking Tarzan Scout LNG. Like, they clearly never have totally been on the same page. And the reason why that's a bomber to me is because Humanoid was way better this last split, but he still has those games where he just completely lets you down. And Razork, I actually think he's the most elo-held player in this team, mate. I actually thought he was fucking really good last split. Like, he had some games where he was looking like if they'd have gone further, he'd have been like an MVP candidate, mate. He was carrying fuck tons of games. games. But the problem I have with him is a bigger issue, which is my final take on Fnatic. Here's the reason why I also don't believe they'll sort of get the most out of these players and rise to form and go to the finals. Because I also think a mistake they've made in this team is if you look at the personality balance, bro, there's no leader on this team. Like, in theory, people would say humanoid because they've heard in past teams he was like shot calling or whatever. No, here the problem with him is he's like, in theory, supposed to lead as like a star. But if you know, he's clearly a guy that sometimes sort of, I mean, I've told the story a million times. It's one of the only people where when I ask a lot of his teammates, they tell me, oh, I can't read him actually. I don't even know. I don't really know where his head's at. That's not great look for the leader because in that scenario, like, you're not getting comfort, you're not getting support, you're not getting like an exact, you don't know where he's at. He just plays and sometimes he pops off, somebody doesn't. And so the problem I have is if you ever look at Razork when they lose those games where he's trying really hard, mate, he looks actually fucking broken, mate. And in this team, the one worry I have is you have this Korean bot lane who doesn't seem like they don't even seem like culturally they're in a position to be the leaders. Humanoid's kind of like, I always say, that fucking cool kid with a leather jacket on a bike that your mum tells you, stay away from him, he's bad news, you know, but somehow he doesn't die when he jumps the ravine. It's just you if you follow him on the motorbike. Oscaridin's got this weird injury thing and he's still trying to figure out his place in the league. And then Razork just basically like looks like he try-hards like a motherfucker and then cry-hards when he fucking doesn't win the game. So I just don't get the vibe of the team. They've got a great sort of like, they don't have an old school Perks or some fantastic leadership figure, you know.
Could you imagine like the Lost Boys, but it's humanoid? It just doesn't quite have the same movie star appeal. But from what I remember from folks on Mad Lions talking about their experiences of humanoid too, he's not a massively talkative person, but he's the kind of person who kind of like talks pretty rarely, but people like respect him when he does talk. But again, that's not the leadership archetype, right? So again, it kind of reduces the conversation down to, well, okay, you're kind of just expecting Razork to do that now. I think I said this before, the last episode I was on this as well. Noah initially didn't want to have a Korean support as well, because he wanted to actually be speaking English with an English-speaking support so he could integrate more with the team atmosphere, which I actually think is a pretty, heads-up decision. Yeah. I think that's something which a lot of imports might not necessarily respect to the same degree or not have that kind of heads-up awareness of long-term planning if you're trying to stick around this region and this team. But, I mean, John was a player who came in from LCK's CL. I'm pretty sure like he was pretty well regarded by the folks which I remember talking about him. But yeah, I mean, the problem is you still got to integrate that communication into the team. Humanoid's not necessarily going to be that leader, and Oscarin has had his own inconsistencies and seems to be quite emotionally charged in his own way. So yeah, you probably are going to have it just come back down to Razork, which sadly has been the case for a lot of teams for him. I even remember back to the Misfits days where it felt like, well, you better be on Echo Jungle and do some insane carrying, otherwise this team's going to go all over the place. I would quite like to see Razork in a team where actually it feels like other people can kind of take some of that burden off of him. It doesn't seem like this will be that team though.
No, I'm with you. Literally, he is just the player I really just want to airdrop to a better team. Like, I feel like if I could
which
put
team
him...
would you put him, though?
Well, here's the problem. It depends how much I'm allowed to hurt people's feelings. Like, low-key, I actually do feel like if you put him in it... By the way, if you put him in, like, BDS, I think they'd fucking win the league or something, mate.
Yeah,
Wouldn't that be fire? Imagine how sick that would be. Him and Lavrov would be the shit, right?
Yeah.
That would be fire.
I like that. Maybe you could put him in something like Mad Koi as well, because although I mean that being said, could you imagine changing the one Spanish jungler for the other one? Oof, that would
the drama would be too much for that.
Yeah,
true.
I would be there for it, but bad. That'd be.
I've also realised that'd be the one reason why I guess I wouldn't put him in BDS. I don't want to take a Spanish player at this point in time and put them into like French Central. I feel like you're going to inevitably scapegoat at that point.
That actually happened because Isma is French speaking, and he was playing on Movistar Riders as the one French player in the Spanish team facing Karmine Corp in Montpellier, but because he was on the Spanish team, he was like, you traitor, and the fans were not particularly fond of him at that point. 5-game series, fantastic series on that, but I kind of feel bad for him there. It's like, I'm French too, can you cheer for me, please?
Right, we've got one team left, and I actually did lift this team till the end on purpose, because I do think this is one of the hardest teams to figure out. It's Vitality, obviously, because this was the team where, if you remember, it was the same the whole split long. No one could ever get a read on this team. Like, they were never bad, and they were never actually properly good. They were always like in some weird superposition between the two. And then there'd be even moments where I'd see like, they're actually, I think, dude, if like Hylissang didn't hit him, maybe they could have won this game. Or you know what? Actually, Kazi was getting through lane. Hey, actually, you know what? This wasn't so bad. They got Fethio to this spot. But then beyond that, like this wasn't like the Mad Lions team that will close all the games out and look awesome and do the late game move. So I feel like it's such a messy squad. And I feel like so much of this Nymaera is that it's one of those teams where it's impossible to talk about without talking about people people like Mark and the coaching staff, right?
Yes.
Because I think almost everyone, just like we all were with Yamato, is assuming that there's going to be a massive influence from the coaching staff on this team. So I get the feeling people actually, if you notice, people didn't ask for everyone to be fired from this team, because I think they get the sense of like, we're supposed to believe, the coaching staff believe in these players and they've got a vision for them. Even Hylissang, bro, because, by the way, I could already have told everyone, that's where Hylissang's got the right fucking coach, mate. This might be the only coaching staff that wouldn't fire his ass after that split, because they really are going to be on the shit of like, if you show up some of his weaknesses, we get all the strengths and then it'll come. So where are you at on this team? I think it's a hard one to read, mate. Where are you at on Vitality?
Oh, I think last time I was on here as well, the way I describe Vitality is it's just such an academically interesting team. Because if you put yourself into the coaching position there, what do you do with this team? I think that VTO actually did. I think whatever's happened with him this split, I felt like a lot of my previous complaints, and let's be honest, everyone's previous complaints about this player as well, he's not going to influence early game. You have to wait for him to get like one item and level 10 or whatever for him to leave lane, and then he'll start making plays. He was actually roaming. I think actually he's done some pretty good job of getting involved with things. And you could see that they had some intricate early game plans with Douglas as well. He got some, first clear, first bloods, and part of that will be Douglas in his own jungle pathing, but if part of that's also being him in communication with his lanes and getting those early wards into the jungle to spot out jungle pathing to allow that. Like, there are bits and pieces of this which are really, really quite successful, but then it's just, piecing them together and actually putting it into a coherent game plan. Because it really feels like when things go off the rails, this team does not have a good plan B. And often the plan B is Hylissang will do something. And in previous teams, maybe that would have worked. It is not working for this team. So you have to just hope that it sticks to plan A. So Hylissang doesn't, go off the roads trying to try to fix a problem and end up making it worse. I think there was an interview with Pad recently where he was talking, and I've heard other people kind of talk about it in the same degree, well, in regards to like how long does it take for a coaching plan to really come to fruition and how much time do you need to do that. A lot of teams would love everything to work within one split or a year. Most of the time when you look at teams, like the Mad Lions, because actually that came from Splice before that, it took them multiple years to get towards that roster. If you look at Peter Dunn going to EG, it took them a long time to get towards like their championship running form as well. This is a multi-year plan most of the time. Do I expect this roster to stay here for multiple years? No. No, I don't think that's going to happen for that kind of long. But this was always just going to be like let's see how long we can leave this in the oven before we're actually kind of sure that this has run its course or whether we need to make changes. The fact that we're seeing some good things out of some players, which I didn't really think would be on the same page, is quite good. But the fact that that's also twinned up with some nonsensical plays which have come through from other players. I mean, there was the one game with Vitality versus Karmine Corp where I was just sat there thinking like, oh my god, these players are just completely not on the same page, where you've got like VTO teleporting topside and everyone dying in mid lane. Moments like that, you realize that people are not on the same page yet to that degree. They are momentarily there for like singular goals, but not for a whole game plan. They're not really they can sometimes plan the next minute, but it's not really the next 5 to 10 minutes, which you kind of need to win higher level League of Legends. So that's kind of what the starting off point from last split that we have. Have to view what's happening with the meta and stuff like this too. When we see champions, like Alistar, Nautilus come back into the meta, I feel like that is better for Hilly in terms of actually having the better tanky roaming supports. And if you can go in towards Alistar, it's harder to int on Alistar when he has an ult, which makes you unkillable. That very much helps. I'm a little bit worried that there are a lot of like global champions which impact the game early from VTO. I don't necessarily see him as the the Twisted Fate Talia player. I much prefer him on more highly mobile, highly damaging picks. So that's going to be something which is going to be quite interesting to track, because if VTO is not going to be on those picks, or if he's not going to be reprising that performance where actually he was getting involved early, then it does kind of leave Hylissang to be the one short calling things. I don't think Douglas has quite matured into that player just yet. So there are some give and takes. If we can just leave Kazi on stuff like, if it's like Senna, Nautilus duty, or like the Smolder, Alistar, those kind of lanes come through, probably benefits them. But like this team is the most hard team to predict in a lot of ways, because this is like a coaching team's dream and a nightmare. Because if this works, no one will ever question the validity of these coaches again. This is such an interesting team to work through. But like the reason for that is because there are so many pitfalls to work through.
Yes. No, the wildest thing is, this is actually the team, by the way. No one was doing it, bizarrely. The joke is, surely this is the team you wanted Trimby to join, boys. Like, wouldn't that be like an immediate, like, potential fix? Like, one, I'm imagining shot calling probably is an issue, because think about this, Nymaera. We've got a Korean fucking top laner, and then the jungler is like a Polish player who's just on, like, essentially doing his first real split. Like, I don't think those players are shot calling. Vethio seems like quite a quiet player, quite frankly. I don't think he's shot. Like, in that scenario, there is no one, so I think you've maybe messed up slightly.
Kazi is about the loudest AD carry you can have in terms of actual shot calling, but like that's still in one lane. It's not anywhere else on the map.
And the other thing is, they also always told me that his whole thing was more like, fully enough, this is why in theory you're supposed to pair great with Hylissang. His shit was more like sort of calling his shot in a fight, basically, I was told. Like, right, if we go on this guy now, basically, like, and everyone follows up, you know. Because I will say, the sad thing about this team is I do think mid in AD, Vethio and Kazi are just really good players. Like, Kazi especially, by the way, he actually was sort of low-key just gate kept by Hylissang in the team this split. Like, he just couldn't do anything in some of these games. I actually thought he played pretty well. I didn't have any criticism of him at all. Vethio also, and with you, I thought after the last years, right, obviously after the XL debacle, we've got to treat this guy with the most ridiculous kid gloves of all time, essentially. Like, we have to take him like he's the fucking American president away the Secret Service, get him through laning phase, and then just go, right, sir, would you like to have fun now? And then he can, like, team fight with item. The joke is, actually, he has somewhat shored up his issues. That's why I get the vibe, quite frankly, some of his issues in XL weren't just gameplay related. I get the vibe, like, the atmosphere just killed his mood, and he didn't know where to go, and he's still young in his career. Classic, exactly. And then the one last thing I would say is this. The one real fear I have, though, is Photon. Because, mate, this player now is the only connecting factor. Remember when he was on Vitality, it was the same story. It was like, hey, he's a pretty good player. Like, he seems like early game is pretty good and he can carry lane. But then it never connects to the team somehow. Like, for real, this player, I've always had this feeling like he almost looks like he plays without comms or something, mate. Like, I don't get it. Because I can't say when I watch him that he's a bad player. Like, I actually think this is a rare example when I was talking about those Koreans before. I see why they gambled on this import. Like, he actually is someone who seems like he's got skills. I could imagine in solo queue or scrims, he's probably carrying games. But something never connects somehow in the teams he's been on, and that's really worrying to me, because I was hoping again that this is one where Mac's going to figure out some angle. You know, you have to use him in think about some of the people Mac's used in top lane, guys. He had the fucking arm up guy. Like, he's had some very unusual he's had some very idiosyncratic top lanes. So I was thinking if anyone could get this skilled player and integrate him, surely it's them, but it hasn't happened yet. So unless I see some big growth there, I have to say this is a team where I'm not going to hate on them, but I low-key do have them in sort of 7th or 8th. Like, I just think they're like a good team, but they're a competent team, but they're not a good team, if you know what I mean.
Yeah, I think that there's enough upsides to get them above like your Rogue, GiantX, and then potentially like one other failing team. You know, there's some upward and downward mobility from a number of these. But yeah, I mean, I don't see this team being able to string together. There may be one series, but not multiple series back to back, because there are just way too many moving pieces. And I feel like maybe it'll be the kind of thing where they end up having to like use a crutch in terms of like support champions for Hylissang, or whether that's for Douglas or something like that. I think Photon, you know, previously he could pretty much take a top lane advantage and win a game with it last year at some points, because he was individually, I mean, actually for a lot of it, I mean, I think a lot of people are quite revisionist in saying that BB was always the best top laner in Europe, but actually Photon was doing really well individually and punishing a lot of these players. He's not at that level right now, though. And we'll see what happens with the top lane changes kind of being affected. You know, Cassandra, huge nerfs. You're not going to have that quite as easily blind picked. And because that's not quite as easily blind picked, maybe you're not going to have as much Udyr. Maybe that opens up stuff like lethality Aatrox for him to do some mechanical plays in lane. I've seen some Gragas around as well, which actually he's been traditionally pretty okay on too. So, yeah, like, jury's out in regards to like how the meta will affect him, but I'm hoping that he can get himself onto stuff, you know, maybe more stuff like the Jax, which is actually one of his better champions like that too. But he's not really the solo game winning factor that we had in previous year Photon.
Well, that's enough talking about Vitality, but I'll be back next week with a different guest to breathe new life into the LEC. Summit Spring.